Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the life of Richard of Normandy, a young prince whose story intertwines with one of medieval England's most tragic moments that shaped the course of an entire kingdom during the early 12th century. We'll softly explore Richard's upbringing in the shadow of the Norman throne, his education under the guidance of learned bishops, his brave service alongside his father King Henry I in the wars against France, and finally the fateful night when the White Ship carried him and 300 others into the cold waters of the English Channel, all while the Norman dynasty stood at the height of its power, unaware that everything was about to change. And before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which period of Norman history interests you most, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the 12th century lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Richard, later known as Richard of Lincoln, came into the world sometime before the year 1101, during a period when England was still adjusting to Norman rule, and his father had not yet worn the crown. To understand Richard's story properly, we must first journey back to the world that preceded his birth, to understand the forces and events that shaped the kingdom into which he would be born. In the autumn of the year 1066, something happened that would forever change the course of English history. Duke William of Normandy, a formidable warrior and shrewd politician who ruled the Duchy of Normandy in what is now northern France, assembled a fleet of ships and an army of knights. His claim was audacious. He believed he had been promised the throne of England by King Edward the Confessor, the previous English monarch, who had died without an heir. When Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, was crowned King of England instead, William decided to enforce his claim through conquest. The crossing of the English Channel was a dangerous undertaking. William had to transport not just his soldiers, but their horses, their weapons, their supplies, everything needed to sustain an invasion force in hostile territory. The fleet that finally set sail numbered hundreds of ships, and the crossing itself was fraught with risk. The Channel is a temperamental body of water, subject to sudden storms, strong currents, and unpredictable weather. Many a ship has been lost in these waters over the centuries, dashed against rocks or overwhelmed by waves. But William's fleet made the crossing successfully, landing at Pevensey on the south coast of England on September the 28th, 1066. The invasion culminated in the Battle of Hastings on October the 14th. King Harold, who had just returned from defeating a Viking invasion in the north of England, rushed south to confront the Norman invaders. The two armies met on a ridge near Hastings, and there, over the course of a long and bloody day, the fate of England was decided. The battle was desperate and uncertain for many hours. Harold's Anglo-Saxon soldiers, fighting on foot behind their shield wall, held their ground against repeated Norman cavalry charges. But as the day wore on, the English line began to weaken. Finally, late in the afternoon, King Harold was killed. Legend says he was struck in the eye by an arrow, though historians debate the exact manner of his death. With their king dead and their line broken, the English army collapsed and fled. Duke William of Normandy had won, but winning a single battle, however decisive, was not the same as conquering an entire kingdom. Over the next several years, William had to fight campaign after campaign, suppress rebellion after rebellion, before his hold on England was truly secure. He built castles, great stone fortresses that dominated the landscape and served as centres of Norman power. He distributed English lands to his Norman followers, creating a new aristocracy that owed everything to him. He introduced new systems of government and law, new ways of organizing society and administering justice. The changes were profound and far-reaching, touching every aspect of English life. The Norman conquest created a unique situation in medieval Europe. The King of England was also the Duke of Normandy, ruler of a territory in France. This meant that the English king was technically a vassal of the French king for his Norman lands, even though, in practice, the Duke of Normandy was far more powerful than his nominal overlord. This complicated relationship would be a source of tension and conflict for centuries, leading to repeated wars and diplomatic crises as English kings struggled to maintain their French possessions against the ambitions of the French crown. By the year 1087, when Duke William, now known to history as William the Conqueror, died from injuries sustained when his horse stumbled during a military campaign, England had been transformed. The Norman elite spoke French among themselves, built in the Norman architectural style, and followed Norman customs. Yet the vast majority of the population was still Anglo-Saxon, speaking English, following English traditions, and harboring varying degrees of resentment toward their Norman overlords. The kingdom was a fusion of two cultures, and the process of blending them together would continue for generations. William the Conqueror left behind a complicated legacy and an even more complicated succession. He had 3 surviving sons, and he divided his lands among them in a way that satisfied none of them, and sowed the seeds of future conflict. To his eldest son, Robert Curthose, he left the Duchy of Normandy, the ancestral homeland of the Norman dynasty. To his second son, William Rufus, so called because of his ruddy complexion, he left the Kingdom of England. And to his youngest son, Henry, he left 5,000 pounds of silver and some lands in England, but no territory that he could rule as his own. This division created an inherently unstable situation. Robert felt that as the eldest son, he should have inherited everything, or at least been given preference in the distribution of lands. William Rufus, finding himself king of a wealthy and powerful realm, had no desire to be subordinate to his older brother, and Henry, the youngest, found himself landless despite being the son of a great conqueror, forced to make his own way in the world with nothing but money and his wits to aid him. The 3 brothers would spend the next decade and more in a complicated dance of alliance and betrayal, cooperation and warfare, as each sought to improve his position at the expense of the others. It was into this world of Norman castles and Anglo-Saxon villages, of feuding royal brothers and ambitious barons, of a kingdom still finding its shape and identity 3 decades after the conquest, that Richard of Normandy would be born. His father, Prince Henry, was at that time a young man in his early 30s, landless but not powerless, educated and ambitious, waiting for his opportunity to rise above the modest station that his father's will had assigned him. Richard came into the world sometime in the late 1090s, most likely between 1097 and 1100. The exact date of his birth was not recorded, which is not surprising given his status as an illegitimate son. Medieval chroniclers carefully noted the births of legitimate heirs to kingdoms and great titles, but the arrivals of bastard children, even royal ones, were usually considered less worthy of precise documentation. We know Richard was born before 1101 because historical records mention him as being old enough to participate in events after that date. But beyond this rough time frame, the specifics of his birth remain a mystery lost to time. His mother, Ansfried, appears in the historical record like a figure glimpsed through morning mist. We know she was there. We can make out her outline, but the details of her life remain frustratingly vague. She was a woman of some standing, respectable enough that her liaison with Prince Henry was noted by chroniclers. but not of such exalted rank. That much was written about her. The medieval sources tell us that she had been married before, that her first husband was a man named Arnskill, about whom we know almost nothing. Whether Arnskill died, or whether the marriage was annulled, we cannot say. What we do know is that at some point after her first marriage ended, Ansfried caught the eye of Prince Henry. In the late 11th century, relationships between princes and women of lower rank were common and generally accepted, provided certain social conventions were observed. A prince was expected to eventually make a politically advantageous marriage to a woman of appropriate rank. But before that marriage, and sometimes even after it, relationships with mistresses were tolerated and even expected. These relationships existed in a sort of social middle ground, not quite respectable in the strictest sense, but not scandalous either, as long as they were conducted with some degree of discretion. Ansfriede is sometimes identified in historical sources as Henry's third mistress, which suggests that by the time of Richard's birth, Prince Henry had already established a pattern of such relationships. This was hardly unusual. Noble and royal men of the period often had multiple mistresses over the course of their lives, and frequently fathered children with several different women. The children of these unions occupied a unique position in medieval society. They were not legitimate heirs, could not inherit titles or lands through normal succession, but they were acknowledged by their fathers and often provided for generously. They bore their father's blood, if not his name, in the fullest legal sense, and that blood connection carried both privileges and expectations. The place of Richard's birth is not recorded in the surviving documents. It might have been in Normandy, perhaps in the Cotentin Peninsula, where his father held some lands, or it might have been in England, in one of the western counties, where Henry also possessed estates, or perhaps it was in some other location entirely, in a manor house or castle where Ansfried was staying at the time. We cannot know for certain. What we can say is that wherever Richard was born, his arrival marked the beginning of a life that would be shaped by the complicated circumstances of his parentage and by the dramatic events that would unfold in the years to come. In the world of the late 11th century, childbirth was always a dangerous undertaking. Women died in childbirth with disturbing frequency, and many infants did not survive their first year. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, infections, any number of things could claim a young life. That Richard survived infancy and grew into childhood was itself no small accomplishment. His mother, Ansfried, clearly also survived his birth, as she appears in later records, and may have borne other children, though the details are unclear. As an infant and young child, Richard would have spent his earliest years primarily in his mother's care. This was the custom of the time. Noble children, even legitimate ones, spent their first years with their mothers and nurses before being sent away for education and training. During these early years, Richard would have been sheltered from the violent and complex political world his father inhabited. The nursery was a place apart, where the concerns were feeding and sleeping and learning to walk and talk, not battles and inheritances and political alliances. But this protected period of childhood could not last forever. By the time a noble boy reached the age of 6 or 7, it was time for his education to begin in earnest. For Richard, this transition came with a significant change in his circumstances. Rather than remaining with his mother or being placed in the care of some minor household, he was sent to be raised and educated in the household of Robert Bloet, the Bishop of Lincoln. This arrangement reveals much about Prince Henry's intentions for his illegitimate son. Bishop Bloet was one of the most important churchmen in England, a man of learning and administrative skill, who would later become one of King Henry I's most trusted advisors and officials. The bishopric of Lincoln was one of the wealthiest and most prestigious in England. covering a vast territory in the east of the country. To be raised in the bishop's household was a significant honour, an indication that Richard was being prepared for a life of importance and responsibility. The decision to place Richard with Bloet was also pragmatic. In the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the church was not just a religious institution, but also the primary centre of learning and education in Western Europe. If you wanted your son to learn to read and write, to study Latin and understand the classical authors, to receive training in theology and philosophy and law, you sent him to be educated by churchmen. The great cathedrals and monasteries were repositories of knowledge, their libraries containing precious manuscripts copied and preserved by generations of monks, their schools producing the educated administrators and officials that kings and lords needed to govern their territories effectively. Bishop Bloet's household would have been a place of order and routine, of prayer and study. The day would have begun early, before dawn, with the first prayers of the day, then lessons in Latin grammar and reading, in scripture and theology, in the skills of writing and calculation that were essential for anyone who hoped to serve in government or the church. There would have been lessons in deportment and manners as well, instruction in how a young nobleman should conduct himself, how to speak properly, how to behave in different social situations, physical training too, learning to ride and to use weapons, for even a boy being educated in a bishop's household was expected to know the martial skills appropriate to his class. Richard would not have been alone in the bishop's household. Bishop Bloet also educated other sons of the nobility, most notably another of Prince Henry's illegitimate sons, a boy named Robert, who was several years older than Richard. This Robert, who would later become the Earl of Gloucester, would grow up to be one of the most powerful and respected nobles in England, a key figure during the Civil War, known as the Anarchy. The two half-brothers would have known each other during their time in Bloet's household, would have studied together, perhaps played together, formed the bonds that come from shared childhood experiences. The bishop himself was a remarkable man. Robert Bloet had risen through the church hierarchy, through a combination of ability, ambition, and political skill. He was learned but also practical, capable of managing the complex affairs of his vast diocese, while also serving the crown in various capacities. He had the trust of powerful men and the skills to navigate the dangerous waters of court politics. For young Richard and Robert, he would have been not just an educator, but also a model of what an intelligent and capable man could achieve through service and loyalty. During these formative years in Lincoln, Richard would have absorbed the values and expectations of his class. He would have learned about honour and duty, about the bonds of loyalty that tied vassal to lord, about the responsibilities that came with noble birth. He would have heard stories of great deeds and heroic warriors, tales of Charlemagne and Roland, of King Arthur and his knights, stories that shaped the medieval imagination and provided models for how a nobleman should behave. He would have learned about his own family's history, about his grandfather William the Conqueror's great victory at Hastings, about the Norman conquest of England, about the glory and the violence that had established his family's position. The world outside the bishop's household during Richard's childhood was turbulent and often dangerous. His father, Prince Henry, and his uncles, Robert Curthose and William Rufus, continued their complicated relationships, sometimes cooperating, often competing, occasionally fighting open wars against each other. In 1091, Robert and William Rufus had joined forces to deprive Henry of the Cotentin, the territory in western Normandy that he had purchased from Robert some years earlier. Henry lost his lands and was forced to flee, taking refuge with various lords and rebuilding his power base slowly and patiently. But Henry was nothing if not resourceful. Over the next several years, he gradually re-established himself, making alliances, winning supporters, positioning himself as a potential alternative to his older brothers. He allied himself with William Rufus against Robert, helping the English king in his conflicts with the Duke of Normandy. Henry proved himself to be a capable soldier and an effective administrator, skills that would serve him well when his opportunity finally came. That opportunity arrived on August 2nd, 1100, in the New Forest in southern England. King William Rufus had gone hunting, accompanied by a party of nobles that included his younger brother Henry. Hunting was one of the favorite pastimes of medieval nobility, a chance to demonstrate skill and courage, to enjoy the outdoors, to temporarily escape the burdens and responsibilities of rule. But hunting was also dangerous. The weapons used, bows and arrows, spears, hunting dogs, could kill a man as easily as they could kill a deer or a wild boar. Accidents were common. What happened in the New Forest that day has been the subject of speculation and debate for more than 9 centuries. The official account, recorded by contemporary chroniclers, states that an arrow fired by Walter Tyrrell, one of the nobles in the hunting party, missed its intended target and struck the king instead, killing him almost instantly. Tyrrell, whether guilty of the fatal shot or not, immediately fled to France, either because he had indeed killed the king or because he feared he would be blamed for it regardless of the truth. But the circumstances were suspicious. Henry was present at the hunt. He had the most to gain from his brother's death, and his actions in the immediate aftermath of William's death suggest a man who was prepared for this opportunity and determined to seize it. While others stood around the king's body in shock, while some went to fetch help or to inform others of the tragedy, Henry acted with stunning speed and decisiveness. He rode hard for Winchester, the old capital of Wessex, and the location of the royal treasury. He seized control of the money and the castle, giving him immediate resources and a base of power. Then, with equal swiftness, he travelled to Westminster, where, just 3 days after his brother's death, he had himself crowned King of England. 3 days. It was an extraordinary display of political skill and ruthless determination. By moving so quickly, Henry presented his older brother Robert Curthose, who was returning from the First Crusade, where he had distinguished himself as a warrior, with a fait accompli. By the time Robert arrived back in Normandy and could think about claiming the English throne that many believed should be his, Henry was already crowned, already gathering support, already consolidating his position. For young Richard, perhaps 8 or 9 years old at the time, and still living in Bishop Bloet's household in Lincoln, the news that his father had become King of England must have seemed like something from one of the heroic tales he had been taught. Overnight, everything had changed. His father was no longer a landless prince scratching for position. He was the King of England, one of the most powerful monarchs in Christendom. And Richard, by extension, was no longer just the illegitimate son of a minor prince. He was the illegitimate son of a king, a position that carried far more weight and opened far more doors. King Henry I moved quickly to secure his position and build support for his rule. He understood that simply wearing the crown was not enough. He needed to win the loyalty of the English barons, demonstrate that he would be a better king than his brothers had been, and prepare for the inevitable challenge from Robert Curthose. One of his first acts was to issue a coronation charter, a document that promised to correct the abuses of his brother William Rufus's reign and to govern more justly. This charter was a clever piece of political theatre, positioning Henry as a reformer and a just ruler in contrast to his predecessor. In November of 1100, just a few months after his coronation, Sir Henry made an even more significant move. He married Matilda of Scotland. This marriage was brilliant on multiple levels. Matilda, originally named Edith, but known as Matilda after her marriage, was the daughter of King Malcolm III of Scotland and St. Margaret of Scotland. Through her mother, she was descended from the old Anglo-Saxon royal line, connecting back through Edgar the Etheling to Edmund Ironside and ultimately to Alfred the Great. By marrying Matilda, Henry was linking the Norman dynasty to the beloved Anglo-Saxon kings of the past, a move calculated to win the support of the English population, who still remembered the old royal house with affection. The marriage also forged an alliance with Scotland, by removing a potential threat from the north and ensuring that the Scottish kings would be less likely to support any rebellions against Henry's rule. And on a personal level, the marriage seems to have been genuinely affectionate. Contemporary accounts suggest that Henry and Matilda cared for each other, that this political union also contained elements of real partnership, and perhaps even love. Queen Matilda quickly proved her worth. She was intelligent, educated, pious, and capable. When Henry had to be absent from England, travelling to Normandy to deal with matters there, Matilda served as regent, governing in his name. She presided over courts, issued charters, received ambassadors, handled the day-to-day administration of the kingdom with skill and confidence. She was also deeply religious and charitable, and founding hospitals and monasteries, caring for the poor, washing the feet of lepers in imitation of Christ's humility. These actions won her the love of the common people and the respect of the church, both valuable assets for her husband's reign. In 1102, Queen Matilda gave birth to a daughter, also named Matilda. A year later, in 1103, she bore a son, William Adelin. The Adelin was derived from atheling, the Anglo-Saxon term for a prince of royal blood, and the use of this title for Henry's son was another deliberate connection to the English royal tradition. With a son to secure the succession and a daughter who could be married off to forge alliances, King Henry's position seemed increasingly secure. But Henry did not forget or neglect his illegitimate children. In fact, he acknowledged them openly and provided for them generously, a policy that set him apart from many other medieval kings. Over the course of his life, Henry would father at least 25 illegitimate children, possibly more, by various mistresses. These children represented both a personal legacy and a political resource. Henry married his illegitimate daughters to important nobles, both in England and on the continent, creating a network of family connections that strengthened his position. His illegitimate sons, meanwhile, were given educations, military training, and opportunities to earn lands and titles through loyal service. For young Richard, growing up in Bishop Bloet's household and watching his father transform from landless prince to secure king, these years must have been formative. He would have understood that while he could not inherit the throne that would go to his legitimate half-brother, William Adelin, he could still have a prosperous and important life if he proved himself worthy. The examples of other royal bastards were before him. His half-brother Robert of Gloucester, educated in the same household, would become one of the greatest lords in the land. Other illegitimate sons of kings had become bishops, abbots, military commanders, powerful barons. There was a path forward for Richard, but it required demonstrating loyalty, capability, and courage. The primary challenge facing King Henry in the years after his coronation was his older brother, Robert Curthose. Robert had never accepted Henry's seizure of the English throne, and he had support from many who believed that, as the eldest son, he should have inherited both Normandy and England. In 1101, just months after Henry's coronation, Robert invaded England with an army, landing at Portsmouth with several hundred men and the backing of some disaffected English barons who resented Henry's rule or hoped to profit from a change of monarch. The two brothers met, but rather than fighting a pitched battle, they negotiated. The resulting Treaty of Alton resolved the immediate crisis through a series of compromises. Robert agreed to recognize Henry as King of England and to renounce his own claim to the English throne. In return, Henry agreed to pay Robert 3,000 marks per year, a substantial sum that would help Robert manage his perpetually troubled finances, and Henry acknowledged Robert as his heir if he should die without legitimate male issue, and various other terms dealt with the return of lands and the treatment of barons who had supported one side or the other during the crisis. The Treaty of Alton brought peace, but it was a fragile peace that everyone understood could not last indefinitely. Henry was not content to leave Normandy in his brother's hands forever, and Robert's weakness as a ruler meant that Normandy was constantly troubled by rebellious barons and border disputes. Over the next several years, the situation in the duchy deteriorated as Robert proved unable or unwilling to maintain order. Barons defied him openly, built unauthorized castles, fought private wars with each other, refused to pay the taxes and feudal dues they owed. Normandy was sliding into chaos, and chaos created opportunity. In 1106, King Henry decided the time had come to act. He invaded Normandy with an English army, determined to take the duchy from his brother by force. The campaign was methodical and well planned. Henry captured castles, won over barons, advanced steadily deeper into Norman territory. Robert Curthose finally gathered his forces and met his brother in battle at Tinchebrai on September the 28th. The Battle of Tinchebrai was decisive. Henry's army, better disciplined and better led than Robert's forces, won a complete victory. Robert himself was captured on the battlefield, along with many of his supporters. Henry showed no mercy to his defeated brother. Rather than allowing Robert to go into comfortable exile or confining him to some pleasant castle where he might live out his days in retirement, Henry had Robert imprisoned. The once Duke of Normandy would spend the rest of his life as a captive, dying in Cardiff Castle in 1134 after 28 years of confinement. It was a harsh fate, but Henry had learned from his father and brothers the dangers of allowing defeated rivals to remain free and potentially plot their return to power. The victory at Tinchebrai reunited England and Normandy under a single ruler for the first time since William the Conqueror's death. Henry now controlled both sides of the English Channel, could move freely between his English and Norman territories, could govern the entire Anglo-Norman realm as an integrated whole. It was a significant achievement, and it marked the beginning of a period of relative stability and prosperity in both England and Normandy. For the next 14 years, and from 1106 to 1120, King Henry would rule with skill and effectiveness. He strengthened royal administration, expanding the power and efficiency of the royal bureaucracy. He developed the Exchequer, the department of royal government responsible for managing finances, into a sophisticated system for collecting revenues and auditing accounts. He extended royal justice throughout his realm, sending royal judges on regular circuits to hear cases and enforce the king's law. He built and maintained castles at strategic locations, ensuring that royal power could be projected into every corner of his territories. Henry also proved capable of ruthless action when he deemed it necessary. Those who rebelled against him or threatened his rule discovered that the king's mercy had limits. When Robert of Bélem, one of the most powerful and troublesome barons in Normandy, rose in rebellion, Henry crushed him completely, besieging his castles one by one until Robert fled to exile. When barons in Normandy resisted his authority, Henry dealt with them harshly, confiscating lands, destroying unlicensed castles, hanging or mutilating those who defied him. The king's justice was swift and often brutal, but it was also effective. Under Henry's rule, law and order prevailed, trade flourished, and the kingdom prospered. All of this, the political maneuvering, The military campaigns, the administrative innovations, the harsh punishments meted out to rebels was part of the world that Richard was growing up to join. As he progressed through his teenage years, still under Bishop Bloet's guidance, our Richard would have been learning not just from books and lessons, but from observing how his father governed, how power was acquired and maintained, how the complex machinery of medieval kingship actually functioned. The education that Richard received in Bishop Bloet's household was comprehensive and demanding. Medieval education for noble boys had several components, each preparing them for the various roles they might be called upon to fulfill in adult life. First and foremost was literacy, the ability to read and write Latin, the universal language of learning, law, and the church throughout Western Europe. In an age when most nobles were illiterate, depending on clerks and scribes to handle written documents, the ability to read and write oneself was a valuable skill that opened doors and created opportunities. Our Richard's Latin lessons would have begun with the basics, learning the alphabet, practicing letter formation, reading simple texts. Gradually, he would have progressed to more complex material, passages from scripture, excerpts from classical authors like Cicero and Virgil, theological treatises, legal documents, historical chronicles. The goal was not just to be able to decode written words, but to truly understand them, to engage with ideas, to think critically about what he read. A well-educated noble in the 12th century was expected to be able to converse intelligently about theology and philosophy, to understand legal arguments, to appreciate literary style and rhetorical skill. Alongside his linguistic education, Richard would have received instruction in the 7 liberal arts, and the standard curriculum of medieval education inherited from the classical world. The trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric formed the foundation. Grammar encompassed not just the rules of Latin, but the study of literature and interpretation of texts. Logic developed the ability to reason clearly, to construct and evaluate arguments. Rhetoric taught the art of persuasive speaking and writing. After mastering the trivium, students progressed to the quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. These mathematical and scientific subjects provided understanding of the order and harmony of creation. But Richard's education was not confined to books and scholarly pursuits. As the son of a king, even an illegitimate son, he needed to be trained in the martial skills appropriate to his station. This meant learning to ride horses, and which might seem simple, but actually required extensive practice to master. A medieval war horse was not like a gentle palfrey used for travel or a farm horse used for ploughing. A destrier, as the war horses were called, was a powerful animal trained to be aggressive in battle, to kick and bite enemies, to respond to subtle commands from its rider even in the chaos and confusion of combat. Learning to control such an animal while wearing armor and wielding weapons took years of practice. Richard would have learned to use the weapons of medieval warfare, the sword, of course, but also the lance for mounted combat, the mace and battle axe for close quarters fighting, perhaps the bow and crossbow as well, though these were more commonly associated with commoners and professional soldiers than with knights. He would have practiced these skills constantly, building the muscle memory and reflexes that could mean the difference between life and death in battle. He would have learned to fight both mounted and on foot, to attack and defend, to work as part of a unit of knights or to engage in single combat. Equally important was training in the elaborate code of behavior that governed noble life. A young nobleman needed to know how to conduct himself at court, how to show proper respect to superiors while maintaining his own dignity, how to speak to ladies, how to behave at formal banquets and ceremonies. Table manners might seem trivial, but in a society where meals were important social occasions and where one's behavior was constantly observed and judged, knowing how to eat properly how to share dishes, how to drink toasts, and how to converse politely during meals. All of this was essential knowledge. The concept of chivalry was also part of Richard's education. Chivalry in the early 12th century was still evolving. Not yet the elaborate code of courtly love and refined manners it would become in later centuries, but already it encompassed certain key values. A knight should be brave in battle, loyal to his lord, generous to dependents, merciful to defeated enemies, at least those of noble rank, and protective of the weak, particularly women and the church. These ideals were held up as models, even if reality often fell short of them. The chivalric tales that Richard would have heard, stories of Roland at Roncevaux, of King Arthur and his knights, of Charlemagne and his paladins, reinforced these values and provided exemplars of knightly virtue. Religious instruction was also central to Richard's education. This was not just a matter of memorizing prayers or attending masses, though those were certainly part of it. Medieval Christianity permeated every aspect of life, providing not just religious belief, but an entire worldview, a way of understanding the cosmos and humanity's place in it. Richard would have learned the stories of the Bible, the lives of the saints, the teachings of the Church Fathers. He would have been instructed in the 7 deadly sins and the virtues that oppose them. He would have learned about the sacraments, about penance and confession, about the hope of salvation and the fear of damnation. The world that Richard was being prepared to enter was one of stark contrasts. It was a world of magnificent stone cathedrals, where light streamed through stained glass windows to illuminate carved stone and precious metalwork, but also a world where most people lived in simple wooden houses with dirt floors. It was a world of elaborate courtly ceremonies and refined manners among the nobility, but also a world of brutal violence where rebellious barons were mutilated or hanged and where warfare was frequent and harsh. It was a world bound together by oaths and obligations, where the bonds between lord and vassal were sacred, but also a world where those same bonds were frequently broken when it seemed advantageous to do so. As Richard progressed through his teenage years, he would have gradually taken on more adult responsibilities and privileges. He would have been knighted at some point, probably in his mid to late teens, in a ceremony that marked his formal entry into the warrior class. The knighting ceremony had both military and religious elements. The candidate would spend the night before in prayer and fasting, preparing his soul for the solemn obligations he was about to undertake. The next day, he would be dressed in new clothes. His sword would be blessed by a priest, and he would kneel before the knight or lord who was to perform the ceremony. That knight would strike him on the shoulder with the flat of a sword, the dubbing, and speak the words that made him a knight. He would then swear oaths to uphold the duties and honor of knighthood. For Richard, being knighted meant he was now ready to take his place in his father's service, to fight in the king's wars, to prove himself worthy of the trust and resources that King Henry had invested in him. And that opportunity would come soon enough, for despite the relative peace and stability of Henry's reign, conflict was never far away. The borders of Normandy abutted the lands of the King of France, and the relationship between these two monarchs, one technically the vassal of the other, but in reality far more powerful, was a constant source of tension. By the time Richard reached his late teenage years, around 1118 or 1119, tensions between King Henry and King Louis VI of France had reached a breaking point. To understand this conflict properly, we must explore the complicated relationship between the English and French monarchs, and a relationship that would shape European politics for centuries to come, and would provide the stage for Richard's first experiences of warfare. King Louis VI of France, known to history as Louis the Fat, because of his considerable girth, had come to the French throne in 1108. He was a capable ruler in many ways, energetic despite his weight, determined to strengthen royal power and extend his authority beyond the small region around Paris, where previous French kings had exercised direct control. But Louis faced a significant problem. His most powerful vassal, the Duke of Normandy, was also the King of England, and this meant that nominally subordinate duke actually commanded far greater resources than Louis himself. The situation was inherently unstable and humiliating for the French king. In theory, the Duke of Normandy owed homage and feudal service to the French king. In practice, when the Duke of Normandy was also King of England, with all the wealth and military power that England could provide, the relationship was reversed. Henry I could field larger armies, had more money to pay soldiers and buy allies, controlled more territory, and wielded more international influence than his nominal overlord. Louis resented this situation deeply and looked for opportunities to diminish Henry's power, and perhaps even to seize some of the Norman lands for himself. The Norman borders with French royal territory, and with the lands of French nobles, who were more genuinely subject to the French king, provided endless opportunities for disputes. There were always questions about exactly where boundaries lay, and about who had rights to certain castles or territories, about whether particular nobles owed their primary loyalty to Normandy or to France. Norman barons who felt aggrieved by Henry's rule could always find a sympathetic ear at the French court, and Louis was happy to encourage and support rebellions against Henry whenever it seemed advantageous to do so. By 1118, a series of border incidents and diplomatic provocations had brought the two monarchs to the brink of war. Louis had been supporting William Clito, the son of Robert Curthose, who had his own claim to Normandy based on his father's dispossession. Various Norman barons who chafed under Henry's firm rule had declared for William Clito, hoping that a weaker duke would give them more independence. Louis saw William Clito as a useful tool to destabilize Henry's rule in Normandy and to create a duke who would be genuinely subordinate to French authority. King Henry responded to these threats with his characteristic combination of diplomacy and military force. He made alliances with Anjou and Brittany, neighboring territories whose rulers had their own reasons to oppose French expansion. He arranged for his son William Adelin, who was now about 16 years old, to be betrothed to Matilda of Anjou, the daughter of Count Fulk V of Anjou. This marriage alliance, sealed with the promise of substantial territories as Matilda's dowry, neutralized one potential enemy and turned Anjou into an ally against France. But diplomacy alone would not be sufficient. Henry prepared for war, gathering his forces in Normandy and preparing to defend his duchy against French aggression. It was in this context, as armies were being assembled and military operations were beginning, that Richard of Normandy, now approximately 19 years old, joined his father's army and prepared to experience warfare for the first time. The medieval warfare that Richard was about to experience was very different from the organized, disciplined campaigns of later centuries. Armies were relatively small, usually numbering in the hundreds or low thousands, rather than tens of thousands. They consisted primarily of mounted knights, the heavy cavalry that formed the elite striking force of any medieval army, supported by infantry armed with spears, bows, and various other weapons. These infantry were often less well trained and equipped than the knights, drawn from the common people through feudal obligations or hired as mercenaries. Campaigns were usually conducted during the warmer months, from spring through autumn, when weather made travel easier and when there was food in the countryside that armies could forage. Winter campaigns were rare and difficult, as cold weather, short days, and the scarcity of food made military operations much more challenging. A typical military campaign might involve marching to enemy territory, besieging castles, raiding to destroy crops and supplies, and occasionally, if circumstances were right, engaging in pitched battles. But battles were actually relatively rare in medieval warfare because they were risky and unpredictable. A lord or king who lost a battle might lose everything. His army destroyed, himself captured or killed, his lands left defenseless. For this reason, many military campaigns consisted primarily of sieges and raids, with both sides trying to avoid battle unless they had a clear advantage. For Richard, joining his father's army meant entering a world very different from the relatively ordered environment of Bishop Bloet's household. Military camps were chaotic, crowded, often unsanitary places. Hundreds or thousands of men and horses living in close proximity created noise, smells, and confusion. There were knights and their retinues, each knight typically accompanied by several servants or squires to care for his horses, maintain his equipment, and assist him in battle. There were infantry soldiers and some professional men-at-arms, but many simply peasants, pressed into service by their lords. There were camp followers, merchants selling supplies, prostitutes, wives and children of soldiers, all the assorted people who attached themselves to armies in hope of profit or safety. The daily life of a military campaign involved a great deal of tedium, punctuated by moments of intense action. There were hours of marching, the columns of men and horses moving along dusty roads or muddy tracks, depending on the weather. There were camps to set up each evening, guards to be posted, scouts to be sent out to reconnoiter the surrounding area. There were horses to be cared for, equipment to be maintained, food to be found and prepared. And always there was the tension of being in hostile territory, the knowledge that enemies might appear at any moment, that an ambush or a raid could disrupt the army's movements or catch unwary soldiers by surprise. Richard would have been part of his father's personal retinue, riding with the king and the other important nobles, probably serving in a role that combined learning and limited responsibility. He was there to gain experience, to observe how military operations were conducted, to begin to prove himself as a warrior. His half-brother William Adelin was also with the army, as were many other young nobles who were using this campaign to demonstrate their worth and courage. The campaign of 1119 moved through Normandy, with King Henry methodically securing his position and dealing with rebellious barons. Some castles that had declared for William Clito were besieged and captured, and some barons who had supported the French cause were forced to submit or fled to French territory. Henry's strategy was to eliminate internal threats before engaging the main French army, to ensure that his rear was secure and that he would not face rebellions while fighting Louis. The climax of the campaign came on August the 20th, 1119, at a place called Brémule. The two armies met in open battle, a rare occurrence that resulted from a combination of circumstances. Both sides felt confident in their chances. The terrain favored an engagement, and diplomatic options had been exhausted. The Battle of Brémule would be one of the defining moments of King Henry's reign, and for Richard, it would be his introduction to the reality of medieval combat. The armies took up their positions early in the day. King Henry's forces, numbering perhaps 400 or 500 knights plus supporting infantry, arranged themselves in the traditional formation. The knights formed the main body, divided into several squadrons or battles, each under the command of an experienced lord or commander. The infantry took position to protect the flanks and to provide support. Standards and banners flew above the troops, the colourful flags serving both as rallying points and as a way to identify different contingents of the army in the confusion of battle. The French army, commanded by King Louis himself, was similarly organised, but less cohesive. Louis had gathered knights from various French territories, but these men did not necessarily know each other well or have experience fighting together. This lack of cohesion would prove to be a significant weakness. Moreover, the French knights, though brave and well-equipped, were facing one of the most formidable military forces in Western Europe, an army led by a king who was himself an experienced and capable warrior. The battle began, as most medieval battles did, with a cavalry charge, the thundering of hundreds of horses' hooves, the shouting of men, the clashing of metal on metal as lances struck shields and armor. The noise and violence of a medieval cavalry engagement were overwhelming to those experiencing it for the first time. Knights on their powerful war horses smashed into each other at full gallop, lances splintering, swords flashing, horses screaming, and men falling to be trampled in the melee. Richard would have been in the thick of this chaos, riding with his father's retinue, experiencing the terror and exhilaration of combat. Medieval battle was intensely personal and physical. There was none of the distance of modern warfare where enemies are killed from far away. In a medieval melee, you were close enough to see your opponent's eyes, to hear his breathing, to smell his sweat and fear. You struck at him with sword or mace, trying to find gaps in his armor, trying to knock him from his horse or batter him into submission. And all around you were other men doing the same, horses crashing into each other, bodies falling, wounded men crying out, the entire scene a confusion of movement and noise and violence. The chronicler, Orderic Vitalis, in his account of the Battle of Brémule, specifically mentions Richard as one of the king's distinguished knight sons present at the battle. And this notation is significant because it tells us that Richard fought well enough to be noticed and remembered. In a battle involving hundreds of participants, to be singled out by name in a chronicle meant that you had done something noteworthy, had demonstrated courage or skill that caught the attention of those recording the event. The Battle of Brémule proved to be a decisive Norman victory. King Henry's better trained and more cohesive forces systematically broke apart the French army. The French knights, despite their individual courage, could not withstand the disciplined charges of the Norman heavy cavalry. Louis's army began to break, with groups of knights fleeing the field rather than face certain defeat or capture. Many French nobles were taken prisoner, a lucrative outcome for the victors since ransoms would have to be paid for their release. King Louis himself narrowly avoided capture, fleeing the battlefield when it became clear that the day was lost. The aftermath of the battle was significant both militarily and diplomatically. Henry had demonstrated conclusively that he could defeat the French king in open combat, a humiliation that Louis would not forget, but that also made him more cautious about directly challenging the Norman duke in the future. The captured French nobles became bargaining chips, their ransoms providing revenue and their release subject to negotiation. And the victory strengthened Henry's position in Normandy, showing the barons who might have been tempted to rebel that opposing the king was a dangerous and likely unprofitable enterprise. For Richard, as surviving his first major battle and earning a mention in the chronicles for his conduct was an important milestone. He had proven himself under fire, had demonstrated that the years of training in arms had prepared him for the reality of combat. He had earned his father's approval and the respect of the other warriors. This success would have been immensely satisfying for a young man, eager to establish his reputation and prove his worth. But the campaign of 1119 was not quite finished, and Richard would have another, more harrowing experience before returning to peacetime pursuits. At some point during the military operations following the Battle of Brémule, during fighting near the strategically important castle of Les Andelys in Normandy, Richard found himself in serious danger. The details of exactly what happened are frustratingly sparse in the historical record. We know that Richard was at risk of being captured by French forces, that he was in a perilous situation where his safety and freedom were seriously threatened. Being taken prisoner would have been a disaster for several reasons. First, there was the personal danger. Prisoners could be injured or killed if negotiations for their release broke down, and the conditions of captivity were often harsh. Second, there was the embarrassment factor. To be captured reflected poorly on a warrior's skill and courage, suggesting he had been outwitted or outfought by his enemies. Third, there were the political implications. A royal prince in enemy hands could be used as a bargaining chip, his release made conditional on territorial concessions or other demands. In this moment of crisis, Richard was rescued by a knight named Ralph the Red of Pontchartrain. Ralph, seeing the danger facing the king's son, acted decisively. Perhaps he charged into the French soldiers who were threatening Richard, scattering them and giving Richard time to escape. Perhaps he organized a rescue party that extracted Richard from an impossible position. The chronicles do not give us these details, only recording that Ralph the Red saved Richard from capture. What we can say with certainty is that Ralph's action earned him the gratitude of both Richard and King Henry, and that a bond was formed between Richard and Ralph, the kind of connection that could develop between warriors who had faced danger together. And this incident at Les Andelys revealed both the dangers of medieval warfare and the importance of loyalty and quick action in the face of crisis. Richard had been at risk, and Ralph had saved him. Such a debt of gratitude was not taken lightly in the medieval world. Bonds formed through shared danger and mutual aid were among the strongest ties that could exist between warriors. Richard would have remembered Ralph's action, would have been grateful for his rescue, would have thought of Ralph as someone he owed a debt to. Little did either of them know that they would face another crisis together, one that neither would survive. Following the military successes of 1119, the conflict with France wound down. King Louis, defeated in battle and unable to dislodge Henry from Normandy, was forced to negotiate. The resulting peace treaty included a provision that was particularly important for the succession. Louis agreed to recognize William Adelin, Henry's son and heir, as the rightful Duke of Normandy. This was a significant diplomatic victory for King Henry. It meant that his son's inheritance was secure, acknowledged not just by the barons of Normandy, but by the French king himself. William Adelin, at 17 years old, was formally invested as Duke of Normandy, receiving the symbols of his office and being acknowledged as his father's heir to both the duchy and the kingdom. For Richard, the campaign of 1119 had been formative. He had experienced battle, proven his courage, survived a close brush with capture, and seen his legitimate half-brother William elevated to formal recognition as heir to their father's domains. Richard's own future, while less exalted than William's, was nevertheless promising. He had demonstrated his value through military service. He had earned his father's trust and favour, and King Henry, true to his policy of providing well for his illegitimate children, was preparing to secure Richard's future through a strategic marriage. In the year 1120, as the military conflicts with France subsided into an uneasy peace, King Henry turned his attention to consolidating his position in Normandy through strategic marriage alliances. For his illegitimate son Richard, now approximately 20 years old and a proven warrior, the king arranged a betrothal that represented both reward for loyal service and careful political calculation about the future of Norman territories. Richard's intended bride was a young woman named Amice de Gael, the daughter and sole heiress of Raoul II de Gael, who held the titles of Seigneur of Gael and Montfort. To understand why this was such an advantageous match for Richard, we need to explore the background of Amice's family and the territories she stood to inherit. Raoul de Gael came from a family with significant holdings in both Normandy and Brittany. His father was the son of Ralph de Gael, who had once been Earl of East Anglia under William the Conqueror. that earlier Ralph had participated in a rebellion against William Rufus in 1075 and had lost his English lands as a consequence, but the family retained substantial estates on the continent. These included the lordship of Gael in eastern Brittany, strategic territories around Montfort in Normandy, and various other properties scattered across the region. The family was well connected, respected, and wealthy. Exactly the sort of family that a royal bastard like Richard might hope to marry into. Raoul himself had proven his loyalty to King Henry during the recent conflicts with France. He had distinguished himself as a defender during the siege of Brémule, fighting bravely for the Norman cause. This loyal service had earned him the king's favour and made him an appropriate ally to be bound even closer to the royal family through marriage. When Henry approached Raoul about a betrothal between Richard and Amice, Raoul agreed, seeing the advantages of such a connection to the crown. For Richard, the betrothal to Amice represented everything a younger son, even a royal bastard, could reasonably hope for. Through marriage to this heiress, he would gain substantial lands and revenues. As Amice's only child, she would inherit all of her father's estates when Raoul died. Richard, as her husband, would control these properties and the income they generated. The territories included not just agricultural lands that would provide steady revenue from rents and crops, but also strategic castles and towns, forests for hunting, mills and markets, all the various sources of income that made up a great lord's wealth. The marriage would also give Richard status and position in Norman society independent of his father. He would be a lord in his own right, not just the king's son, but a landholder with his own vassals, his own responsibilities, his own place in the complex web of lordship and obligation that structured medieval society. He could establish his own household, raise children who would inherit these estates, found a dynasty that might last for generations. It was the kind of future that any young man of his time and station would have desired. The betrothal negotiations would have involved detailed discussions about the specifics of the arrangement. What exactly would Amice's dowry consist of? Which specific properties would she bring to the marriage? What rights would Richard have over these territories? What obligations would he owe to the king and to other lords? Medieval marriage among the nobility was as much a business transaction as a personal union, and careful attention had to be paid to all the legal and financial details. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis, who provides much of our information about Richard's life, specifically notes that the betrothal included Breteuil, Glos, and Lyre as part of Amice's dowry. These were significant holdings in eastern Normandy and neighbouring regions, territories that would make Richard a wealthy and powerful lord. Breteuil was a particularly important castle and lordship, a strategic site that controlled key routes in the region. Glos and Lyre were similarly valuable properties. Together, these holdings would provide Richard with the resources to maintain a knightly household, to support his own military retinue, to live in the style appropriate to his rank. As preparations for the marriage moved forward, Richard must have felt that his life was coming together beautifully. He was about 20 years old, in the prime of his youth and strength. He had proven himself in battle, fighting alongside his father and earning recognition for his courage and skill. He had the king's favour and support. He was betrothed to an heiress who would bring him wealth and status. His legitimate half-brother William was secure in his position as heir to England and Normandy. The kingdom and duchy were at peace after the successful military campaigns against France. Everything seemed to be falling into place. Richard would have been making practical preparations for his new life as a married lord. He would need to think about establishing a household, about hiring stewards and officials to help manage his estates, about the practicalities of lordship. He would need to become familiar with the specific properties he would be controlling, to understand the resources they provided, and the obligations they entailed. If he had not already done so, he would need to begin thinking about the shift from being primarily a warrior and a king's son to being a landowner with responsibilities for managing estates and caring for the people who lived on them. Medieval lordship involved more than just collecting rents and living off the land. A lord had obligations to his vassals and tenants, duties that were taken seriously in a society structured around mutual obligations. He was expected to provide justice, to hear disputes and render judgments, to protect his lands and people from enemies, to maintain the castles and defences that kept everyone safe. A good lord was one who fulfilled these obligations faithfully, who cared for those dependent on him, who managed his estates well so that they remained productive and prosperous. Our Richard would have understood these expectations and would have been preparing to meet them. The betrothal to Amice also meant that Richard would be establishing ties to Brittany, the region where much of her family's wealth was concentrated. Brittany was a complicated place in the political geography of the time. It was theoretically part of the Kingdom of France, but Breton nobles jealously guarded their independence and had their own language, culture, and traditions distinct from both the French and the Normans. By marrying into a family with Breton connections, Richard would be creating bonds that could be useful for King Henry's broader political strategies in the region. We know frustratingly little about Amice herself. The medieval chronicles that provide our information about this period were written by monks and clerics who cared primarily about political events, military campaigns, and the doings of kings and great lords. Women, even noble women, appear in these records mainly when they married, bore children, or died. We do not know how old Amice was at the time of her betrothal to Richard, though she was probably in her teens, as was typical for noble brides of the period. We do not know if she and Richard had met, if they had any feelings about the marriage beyond accepting it as their duty, if they looked forward to building a life together, or simply resigned themselves to an arrangement made for political reasons. What we do know is that Amice did not accompany the royal party when they prepared to return to England in November of 1120, and whether this was because the wedding had not yet taken place, or because even if married they had not yet set up a shared household, or simply because she happened to be elsewhere at the time, we cannot say. This absence would prove to be extraordinarily fortunate for Amice. She would survive to marry another man, Robert de Beaumont, the Earl of Leicester, who was made the king's ward. She would live until 1168, long enough to see the end of the civil war known as the Anarchy, and the establishment of the Plantagenet dynasty under Henry II. Throughout those decades, did she sometimes think of Richard, the young man she had been betrothed to but never married, whose life had been cut short just as everything seemed to be beginning for him? We cannot know, but it is hard to imagine that she forgot him entirely. For Richard, in the autumn of 1120, the future looked bright. He was a proven warrior, trusted by his father, betrothed to an heiress, positioned to become a significant lord with lands and status. His relationship with his legitimate half-brother William Adelin appears to have been good. The two young men had campaigned together, and William seems to have accepted and welcomed his illegitimate half-siblings as part of the extended royal family. Richard's other half-sister, Matilda Fitzroy, Countess of Perche, was also part of the royal circle, married to a count and well established in Norman society. The world that Richard inhabited in November of 1120 was one of courts and castles, of elaborate ceremonies and chivalric display, but also one of genuine religious faith and sincere piety. Our medieval people believed deeply in God, in heaven and hell, in the importance of living virtuously and preparing one's soul for judgment. They saw God's hand in everything that happened, interpreted events as divine providence or punishment. sought to understand God's will through prayer and the guidance of the Church. This religious worldview would shape how people interpreted the catastrophe that was about to occur. When disaster struck, when hundreds of lives were lost in a single night, medieval chroniclers and common people alike would search for a theological explanation. What sins had brought such divine wrath? What lesson was God trying to teach? The explanations they would offer: that the disaster was punishment for drunkenness, for sexual immorality, and for pride and presumption, reflected their deep belief that nothing happened by chance, that every event had meaning in God's plan, even if that meaning was sometimes difficult to discern. But in November of 1120, as the royal court gathered at the Norman port of Barfleur to return to England after months on the continent, Richard had no premonition of disaster. He had every reason to believe that he was embarking on a routine voyage across the English Channel, a journey he had probably made multiple times before. Within hours, he would be in England. Within days or weeks, plans for his marriage to Amice would continue to develop. His life stretched ahead of him, full of promise and potential. Everything seemed right with the world. The port town of Barfleur, situated on the northeastern tip of the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy, had long been an important embarkation point for travel between Normandy and England. In November of 1120, as King Henry I and his extensive court prepared to cross the English Channel and return to England, the small town would have been bustling with activity. Ships crowded the harbour, their masts rising like a forest above the water. Sailors moved about the vessels, checking rigging, loading supplies, making ready for the crossing. On shore, nobles and their retinues waited. Servants handled baggage and equipment. Horses stamped and whinnied. And everywhere there was the noise and confusion of a major royal journey. King Henry had spent the better part of 1120 in Normandy, and attending to the duchy's affairs after the successful conclusion of the military campaigns against France. He had held courts, issued charters, dispensed justice, received the homage of his Norman barons, and generally carried out the business of governance. His son William Adelin had formally received recognition as Duke of Normandy, a significant milestone in the succession planning. Now, with autumn turning to winter, it was time to return to England and attend to matters there. The crossing of the English Channel was never to be taken lightly, even in the best conditions. The channel is approximately 21 miles across at its narrowest point, between Dover and Calais, but the crossing from Barfleur to the English coast was longer, perhaps 60 or 70 miles, depending on exactly where in England one was heading. In the 12th century, without modern navigation equipment or weather forecasting, this crossing was a significant undertaking. Ships depended on wind and current, on the skill of their captains and crews, on good fortune and divine providence. The vessels used for such crossings were not large by modern standards. A typical ship of the period might be 40 to 50 feet long, powered primarily by oars, though also equipped with a single sail that could be raised when the wind was favourable. These ships had open decks with little protection from the elements, and passengers would have been exposed to wind, spray and rain throughout the voyage. In good weather, with favourable winds and calm seas, the crossing might take as little as 12 hours. In poor conditions, it could take much longer, or might not be possible at all until the weather improved. The timing of the crossing was important. November was late in the sailing season. The weather in the English Channel tends to deteriorate as autumn progresses into winter, with storms becoming more frequent and conditions more dangerous. Prudent captains preferred to make crossings during the warmer months when the risks were lower. But royal schedules did not always accommodate such caution. If the king needed to be in England, then the crossing would be made regardless of the season. Trusting in skilled seamanship and divine protection, to ensure a safe passage. On November the 25th, 1120, the weather was judged acceptable for the crossing. The winds were suitable, the seas were not too rough, and King Henry decided to depart. His ship, and several others in the royal fleet, made ready to sail. The king boarded his vessel along with some of his attendants and courtiers. The crews took their positions, and the ships began to move out of Barfleur harbour, heading northwest across the channel toward England. It was at this point that a ship captain named Thomas Fitzstephen approached the king with a proposal. Thomas explained that he had a ship, which he called the White Ship, or La Blanche Nef in French, that was available to transport the royal party. He described his vessel as newly fitted out, fast and seaworthy, a ship worthy of carrying a king. Thomas also mentioned his family connection to royal service. His father, Stephen Fitzgerald, had been the captain of the Mora, the ship that had carried William the Conqueror across the Channel during the invasion of 1066. Thomas was offering his services in continuation of his family's tradition of serving the Norman dukes and English kings. King Henry listened to Thomas's petition, but declined the offer. He had already made arrangements for his own crossing, had his own ship and crew ready, saw no reason to change his plans at the last moment. The king's ship was probably a vessel he knew well, crewed by sailors he trusted, commanded by a captain with proven experience. Changing to an unfamiliar ship would have seemed unnecessary and potentially risky. But King Henry, perhaps out of generosity, perhaps recognizing Thomas's desire to serve the crown, made a counter-suggestion. While he would not take the White Ship himself, and Thomas could use his vessel to transport the king's son William Adelin and many of the other young nobles who were part of the royal entourage, this would fulfill Thomas's wish to serve the royal family, while also honouring his father's memory by carrying the next generation of the dynasty, just as his father had carried the previous one. Thomas Fitzstephen eagerly accepted this revised arrangement. Carrying the heir to the throne would be an enormous honour, a validation of his family's service and his own skill as a captain. He assured the king that the White Ship would give William and his companions a swift and safe crossing. Indeed, Thomas may have boasted that his vessel, being fast and well built, might even overtake the king's ship and reach England first despite leaving later. With this arrangement settled, King Henry departed Barfleur on his own ship, heading out across the Channel with a portion of his court. He had no reason for concern. The weather was acceptable. His son would follow shortly on a good ship with an experienced crew, and within hours they would all be reunited in England. The king's ship made the crossing successfully, arriving safely on the English coast after an uneventful voyage. Henry would not learn until days later that for those who remained behind in Barfleur, the situation was very different. After King Henry's departure, those who remained in Barfleur to sail on the White Ship were in no particular hurry to leave. The afternoon stretched into evening, and what had been planned as a simple departure transformed into an impromptu celebration. William Adelin, the 17-year-old heir to England and Normandy, was at the centre of this gathering. He was surrounded by other young nobles, the cream of Anglo-Norman society, young men and women who represented the future of the kingdom and duchy. Among this company was Richard of Normandy, William's illegitimate half-brother, fresh from his military successes and looking forward to his marriage to Amice. Also present was Matilda Fitzroy, Countess of Perche, another of Henry's illegitimate children, a woman who had married well and established herself in Norman aristocratic society. Richard d'Avranches, the Earl of Chester, was there too, one of the most powerful nobles in England, whose earldom controlled vast territories in the northwest of the country. His wife, Lucia Mahot of Blois, accompanied him. She was the sister of Stephen of Blois, who was King Henry's nephew, and her presence meant that yet another branch of the extended royal family was represented on the ship. Geoffrey Riddell, a royal justice who served in King Henry's administration, was among the passengers. So too were scores of other young nobles, whose names are recorded in the chronicles of the disaster. Sons and daughters of great families, heirs to estates and titles, young people who had been at court gaining experience and making connections, all now preparing to return to England. The passenger list read like a directory of the Anglo-Norman elite. These were not just any nobles, but specifically the younger generation, the people who should have been leading the kingdom for the next 40 or 50 years. Also boarding the White Ship were servants, attendants, and various other people attached to the noble passengers. A household knight here, a lady's maid there, grooms to care for the horses, clerks who handled administrative duties, all the various people needed to support a noble household. The exact number of people who boarded the White Ship is uncertain. Contemporary chronicles give estimates ranging from around 250 to 300 or slightly more. What is certain is that the ship was crowded, filled well beyond what might have been wise for safe sailing. As the afternoon progressed and the ship remained in harbour, someone, perhaps William Adelin himself, perhaps one of the other young nobles, decided that before they sailed, they should celebrate. After all, they had good reason for celebration. The war with France had been won. William had been formally recognised as Duke of Normandy. The kingdom and duchy were at peace. They were young, privileged, powerful, and the future belonged to them. Why not mark the occasion with wine and festivity? Barrels of wine were brought aboard the White Ship. Not just a few barrels, but many, enough to supply a large and thirsty crowd. The wine flowed freely as the young nobles drank and laughed and enjoyed each other's company. In the medieval world, wine was a common beverage, safer to drink than water which might be contaminated, and integral to social gatherings. But the amount being consumed on the White Ship that November afternoon went well beyond normal social drinking. This was revelry, a party that grew louder and more raucous as the hours passed and the wine continued to flow. At some point in this celebration, the passengers made a decision that would prove fatal, and they began to share their wine with the crew. The sailors, who would need all their skill and attention to navigate the ship safely through the dangerous waters around Barfleur, began drinking alongside the nobles they were supposed to be transporting. Captain Thomas Fitzstephen, who should have maintained discipline and ensured his crew remained sober for the voyage ahead, either participated in the drinking himself, or at least did not stop it. Perhaps he was caught up in the festive atmosphere. Perhaps he was reluctant to discipline his crew in front of the heir to the throne. Perhaps he too had been drinking. Whatever the reason, the normal barriers between passengers and crew broke down, and the White Ship became a floating party where everyone, nobles and sailors alike, drank wine and celebrated, and the atmosphere on the White Ship grew increasingly chaotic as the evening wore on. The noise level rose, laughter, singing, shouting, the sounds of young people enjoying themselves without restraint or supervision. Some passengers, observing the deteriorating situation, became uncomfortable. This was not how a royal voyage should be conducted. This was not proper or safe. Several people decided to leave the ship before it sailed. Most notably, 2 priests who had come to bless the vessel before its departure were roughly turned away by the drunken crowd. The blessing of ships before they sailed was a normal practice in the deeply religious medieval world, a way of asking for God's protection during the dangerous voyage ahead. But the intoxicated passengers and crew on the White Ship apparently found the priest's presence amusing or irritating. They mocked the priests, made jokes, and chased them away. The priests left, refused to give their blessing, and departed the ship. Later, after the disaster, this incident would be remembered as an omen, a sign that the voyage was cursed from the start, that God had withdrawn his protection because of the disrespect shown to his servants. Stephen of Blois, King Henry's nephew, also left the White Ship before it sailed. The official explanation, recorded by the chronicler Orderic Vitalis, was that Stephen developed a sudden case of diarrhea and could not travel. Whether this was actually true, or whether Stephen simply had the good sense to realize that boarding a ship with a drunken crew was extremely unwise, his decision to disembark saved his life. This Stephen would later seize the English throne after King Henry's death, triggering the civil war known as the Anarchy. If he had remained on the White Ship and drowned with everyone else, the entire course of English history would have been different. Several other nobles also chose to leave the ship, observing what one chronicle describes as the vessel upon observing that it was overcrowded with riotous and headstrong youths. These people, whose names are mostly lost to history, escaped the fate that awaited those who remained. But most of the passengers stayed, caught up in the excitement and celebration, perhaps not fully appreciating the danger of what they were about to do, perhaps trusting that Thomas Fitzstephen's confidence in his ship and his boasts about its speed and seaworthiness were justified. By the time the White Ship was finally ready to depart, it was evening. The sun had set, and darkness was settling over the harbour. The moon was rising, providing some light, but not enough to make navigation easy. The king's ship had left hours earlier and was probably already approaching the English coast. The White Ship was late, very late, and everyone aboard was drunk or at least heavily affected by alcohol. Under these circumstances, a wise captain would have postponed the voyage until morning, when light and sobriety would make the crossing safer. But Thomas Fitzstephen, impaired by drink and perhaps by pride, made a different decision. Someone on the ship, perhaps one of the young nobles, perhaps multiple voices joining together, called out a challenge. The king's ship had left hours ago. Could the White Ship, which Thomas had boasted was the fastest vessel on the water, still catch up? Could they overtake the king and reach England first? It was meant as a jest, perhaps, or as a dare, the kind of reckless challenge that drunk young men might make without thinking through the consequences. But Thomas Fitzstephen, instead of dismissing this foolish suggestion, accepted the challenge. Yes, he declared, the White Ship would overtake the king. They would reach England first. His ship was fast, his crew was skilled, and they would show everyone what they could do. The passengers cheered, excited by the prospect of this race, not understanding or not caring about the dangers. The crew, equally drunk and caught up in the bravado, unprepared to depart. The oarsmen took their positions at the rowing benches. The White Ship was powered primarily by oars, with 50 experienced rowers who could drive the vessel through the water at considerable speed. When these men pulled together, the ship could move swiftly indeed. But tonight, these oarsmen were drunk, their judgment impaired, their coordination affected by the wine they had consumed. Nevertheless, they took up their oars and prepared to row. The ropes holding the White Ship to the dock were cast off. The vessel began to move, pulled away from the shore by the oarsmen's efforts. Captain Thomas Fitzstephen stood at the steering position, responsible for navigating the ship out of the harbour and setting their course for England. The passengers continued their celebration, calling encouragement to the crew, urging them to row faster, excited about their adventure. The White Ship moved out into the harbour, picking up speed as the rowers found their rhythm and pulled harder. The chronicler William of Malmesbury, writing several years after the disaster, captured the mood on the ship in his account. The sailors, too immoderately filled with wine, with that seaman's hilarity which their cups excited, exclaimed that those who were now ahead must soon be left astern, for the ship was of the best construction and recently fitted with new materials. The crew was confident, perhaps overconfident, in their ability to make up for lost time and overtake the king's ship. But there was a critical problem. In their haste and their drunkenness, Captain Thomas and his crew had not paid proper attention to their course as they departed the harbour. Just off the coast at Barfleur, near a point called Gataville, where there is now a lighthouse to warn ships of the danger, there was a rock. This rock, known locally and marked on charts that experienced pilots consulted, was a serious hazard to navigation. It jutted up from the seabed, submerged but close enough to the surface that ships passing over it at high tide could strike it. Experienced captains who knew these waters understood exactly where this rock was located and how to avoid it. On a normal voyage, with a sober crew and careful navigation, avoiding this rock was routine. But this was not a normal voyage. The crew was drunk. Captain Thomas's judgment was impaired. The ship was moving fast, driven by the oarsmen's powerful strokes as they responded to the challenge to overtake the king. It was dark, and with only moonlight to see by, and critically, no one on the white ship was paying proper attention to exactly where they were going. They were focused on speed, on catching up with the king's ship, on proving their boasts. Navigation, the careful attention to position and course that safe sailing required, was forgotten in the excitement and the alcohol-fueled confidence. The white ship struck the rock at full speed. The impact was catastrophic. The rock tore into the hull, ripping open the planking below the waterline. Water immediately began pouring into the ship through the gaping hole. The vessel, which moments before had been racing confidently across the water, was suddenly mortally wounded. Within seconds, everyone aboard knew they were in terrible danger. The moments immediately following the impact were chaotic beyond description. The ship shuddered from the collision, throwing people off their feet. The sound of splintering wood, of water rushing in, of people beginning to scream, filled the night air. The white ship, moving at high speed when it struck the rock, had suffered massive damage. The force of the collision had opened a large breach in the hull, and the cold water of the English Channel in late November was flooding into the vessel. Medieval ships, unlike modern vessels, had no watertight compartments, no pumps powerful enough to deal with major flooding, no sophisticated damage control systems. When a ship's hull was breached and water came pouring in, and there was little that could be done except try to reach shore before the ship sank or abandon ship and hope to survive in the water. The white ship was approximately 1 mile from the coast when it struck the rock, close enough that land was visible, but far enough that reaching safety would be difficult, especially in the dark, in cold water, for people wearing heavy medieval clothing that would quickly become waterlogged. The initial shock gave way to panic as people realized the severity of the situation. Passengers scrambled to find ways to save themselves. Some tried to grab onto pieces of the ship, looking for anything that might float and support them when the vessel went down. Others pushed toward the sides, preparing to jump into the water and swim for shore. The crew, presumably more experienced with maritime disasters, would have been trying to assess the damage and determine if anything could be done to save the ship. But the breach was too large, the water coming in too fast. The white ship was doomed. In this moment of crisis, someone, perhaps one of the ship's officers, perhaps one of the nobles who kept their head, managed to get William Adelin, the heir to the throne, into a small boat. Most ships of this era carried one or more small boats that could be used for various purposes, including emergencies. This boat was quickly launched, and William was placed in it, along with several other people. If they could row this small boat to shore, at least the king's son would be saved. The succession would be secure. The disaster would still be terrible, but it would not be a complete catastrophe. Should the small boat begin to pull away from the sinking white ship, rowing toward the shore and safety. For a brief moment, it must have seemed that at least some would survive. But then, above the noise of the disaster, the screaming of people in the water, the creaking and groaning of the dying ship, the splash of waves, William heard something that would seal his fate and change the course of history. Among the voices calling out in terror and desperation, William recognized one in particular. His half-sister, Matilda Fitzroy, the Countess of Perche, was in the water, struggling, calling for help, begging her brother to save her. The chronicles tell us that when William heard his sister's cries, he could not bear to leave her. Whether motivated by love, by a sense of duty, by the knightly code that said a nobleman must protect women, or by simple human compassion, William ordered the small boat to turn back toward the wreck. This decision, made in a moment of crisis with no time for careful thought, was both noble and fatal. The small boat turned and headed back toward the white ship. As it approached the area where people were in the water, desperate hands reached out, grabbing at the sides of the boat, trying to climb aboard, trying to save themselves. Everyone in the water wanted to get into the boat. Everyone thought that getting into the boat was their only chance of survival. But the small boat was not designed to hold so many people. As person after person tried to climb aboard, as more and more weight pressed down on the vessel, the inevitable happened. The boat capsized, throwing everyone into the freezing water of the English Channel. William Adelin, the heir to England and Normandy, the young man who had just been recognized as Duke of Normandy, the prince on whom all of King Henry's succession plans depended, went into the water and drowned. Matilda Fitzroy, whose cries had prompted William to turn back, drowned as well. Richard of Normandy, who had fought bravely at Brémule, who had been saved from capture at Les Andelys by Ralph the Red, who was betrothed to an heiress and had his whole future before him, drowned. Ralph the Red himself, the loyal knight who had rescued Richard, drowned. All around them, hundreds of other people were dying too. Richard d'Avranches, Earl of Chester, one of the most powerful men in England, his wife Lucia Mahot, Geoffrey Riedel the Royal Justice, scores upon scores of young nobles whose names fill the chroniclers' lists of the dead, servants and sailors, and all the various people who had been aboard the white ship. The water was shockingly cold. November in the English Channel is no time for swimming, and the water temperature would have been perhaps 50 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. At such temperatures, hypothermia sets in quickly. Even strong swimmers, even people who were not injured in the disaster, would have had difficulty surviving more than 30 or 40 minutes in water this cold. And most medieval people could not swim well or at all. Swimming was not a common skill in an age before public pools and swimming lessons. Even sailors often could not swim, which seems strange to modern sensibilities, but was simply the reality of the time. Moreover, the clothing that medieval people wore was a serious liability in the water. The nobles aboard the white ship would have been dressed in their finest clothes. Heavy wool garments, layers of fabric, leather shoes or boots, perhaps fur-lined cloaks. When these clothes became waterlogged, they would have become incredibly heavy, pulling their wearers down, making it almost impossible to stay afloat. The servants would have been more simply dressed, but even simple medieval clothing could become a death trap in the water. As the minutes passed, the sounds of the disaster gradually changed. The initial screaming and shouting, the calls for help and prayers for mercy, slowly diminished as person after person succumbed to the cold or drowned. The white ship itself, its hull breached and taking on water, settled lower and lower in the sea until finally it slipped beneath the surface entirely, and pieces of wreckage floated on the water, broken planks, barrels, pieces of rigging, but the ship itself was gone, resting on the seabed about 10 meters below the surface, where it would remain for 9 centuries. In the darkness and chaos of the disaster, two men managed to find the broken mast of the white ship floating in the water and cling to it. One was a young nobleman named Geoffrey, son of Gilbert de L'Aigle. Geoffrey was from an important Norman family, and he had been part of the royal entourage aboard the ship. Now he clung desperately to this piece of wreckage, his only hope of survival. The other man was named Berold, a butcher from Rouen, who had been on the ship for reasons that had nothing to do with royal service or noble status. Berold was trying to collect money that some of the nobles owed him. Apparently, he had sold them meat on credit and was hoping to get paid before they left for England. His commercial errand had put him on the white ship, and now he found himself in the water, fighting for his life. These two men, holding onto the floating mast, survived through the long, cold night as everyone around them died. They heard the sounds of death gradually fade into silence. They felt the cold seeping into their bodies, sapping their strength, threatening to make them let go and slip under the water. They waited, hoping for rescue, praying for dawn, enduring hour after hour of exposure to the cold water and wind. As the first light of dawn approached, a third man surfaced near the mast. It was Captain Thomas Fitzstephen, who had somehow survived the initial sinking and remained underwater or elsewhere until this moment. Thomas, seeing Geoffrey and Berold clinging to the mast, swam toward them and called out, asking if the king's son had been saved. When they told him that William Adelin was dead, that the heir to the throne had drowned, Thomas made no attempt to save himself. He let go, slipping beneath the water, choosing death rather than facing what he had done. Whether this was suicide born of guilt and shame, or whether Thomas simply had no strength left and gave up when he learned that his negligence had cost the king his heir, we cannot know. But Captain Thomas Fitzstephen drowned, taking with him to the grave his knowledge of exactly what had happened in those final moments before the white ship struck the rock. As the sun rose on November the 26th, 1120, the fishermen of Barfleur set out for their day's work as they did every morning. The sea was calm, the weather had improved, and they had no reason to expect anything unusual. But as they sailed out from the harbour, they began to see wreckage floating in the water. Pieces of wood, barrels, bits of cloth and rope, the debris of a shipwreck. And then they saw bodies, dozens of bodies, floating in the current or washed up on the rocks. And finally, they found two men still alive, barely, clinging to a piece of mast. The fishermen pulled Geoffrey de L'Aigle and Berold the butcher from the water and brought them ashore. After a night in the cold water, both men were suffering from severe hypothermia. Geoffrey, who had been in his fine noble clothing which had absorbed water and pulled him down all night, did not survive long after his rescue. The combination of cold, exhaustion, and possibly injuries sustained during the disaster proved too much for him. He died shortly after being brought to land, having survived the sinking only to succumb in the aftermath. Only Berold, the butcher from Rouen, lived. His survival was probably due to several factors. He was dressed in simple clothing made from sheepskin and goatskin, materials that provided better insulation against the cold than the wool and linen garments worn by the nobles. He may have been physically stronger, more accustomed to hard labor and harsh conditions. He may simply have been extraordinarily lucky. Whatever the reasons, Berold became the sole survivor of the White Ship disaster, and the only person who could testify to what had happened that terrible night. Over the days and weeks that followed, some bodies washed ashore along the Norman coast. Among them was Richard of Normandy. He had been in the water long enough that his face was gone, destroyed by the action of the sea, the rocks, and the creatures that live in the ocean. But he was identified by his clothing, by the fine garments that marked him as nobility, that told those who found him that this was one of the king's sons. Ralph the Red, who had saved Richard's life at Les Andelys, was also among the recovered dead. The two men who had formed a bond through shared danger in war now lay dead together, both victims of the same maritime disaster. Most of the victims were never recovered. Their bodies remained in the English Channel, either on the seabed near the wreck or carried away by the currents to be lost forever. 300 people had boarded the White Ship. Only one survived. It was one of the worst maritime disasters in medieval history, made worse by who had died. This was not just a tragedy of numbers, though 300 deaths certainly represented a terrible loss. This was a disaster that had decapitated an entire generation of the Anglo-Norman aristocracy. The heir to the throne was dead. The Earl of Chester, one of the most important nobles in England, was dead. Royal princes and princesses were dead. The sons and daughters of great families, the people who should have been providing leadership and stability for the next 50 years, were dead. The immediate consequences would be a succession crisis that would plunge England into civil war. The long-term consequences would echo through English history for centuries. Back in England, King Henry went about his business, unaware that his son was dead, that his carefully constructed succession plans had collapsed, that everything had changed. Days passed. The White Ship did not arrive. At first, this might not have seemed particularly alarming. Perhaps they had decided to delay their departure. Perhaps the weather had turned, and they were waiting for better conditions. Ships were sometimes delayed. It happened. But as more time passed with no word, concern grew into alarm, and alarm into dread. Where was the White Ship? Where was William? Where were all the nobles who should have arrived days ago? Finally, the terrible truth could no longer be avoided. Word reached England of the disaster. The White Ship had sunk, and everyone aboard was dead. The king's son and heir was gone. No one wanted to be the person to tell King Henry this news. The chronicles record that his courtiers and attendants knew about the disaster, but were terrified to inform the king. They understood that this news would devastate him, and they feared his reaction. Finally, according to one account, they found a young boy and pushed him forward to deliver the message. The boy, stammering and frightened, told the king that his son was dead. King Henry's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. According to the chroniclers, he collapsed when he heard the news. He fell to the ground and had to be carried by his friends to his chambers. He was screaming, crying out in anguish, completely overcome by grief. The loss of a child is devastating in any era. But for King Henry, and this was not just personal grief, but political catastrophe, he had lost not only his beloved son, but his heir, the person who was supposed to continue his dynasty and rule after him. The chronicler William of Malmesbury, writing a few years after the disaster, captured the magnitude of the loss in words that have echoed through history. No ship that ever sailed brought England such disaster. None was ever so notorious in the history of the world. This was not mere hyperbole. The White Ship disaster had changed everything. The future that everyone had assumed was coming. William succeeding his father as King of England and Duke of Normandy, continuing the Norman dynasty, providing stability and continuity. That future was gone, vanished in a single night of tragedy. Popular legend, repeated by many later writers, claims that King Henry never smiled again after learning of his son's death. Whether this is literally true or merely a poetic expression of the king's grief, we cannot know with certainty. But there is no doubt that the disaster affected Henry profoundly for the remaining 15 years of his life. One concrete manifestation of his grief, and perhaps his attempt to atone for whatever sins had brought such punishment upon him, was his foundation of Reading Abbey in 1121. Less than a year after the White Ship sank, Reading Abbey was one of the grandest monasteries in England. Built on a scale and with a richness that reflected both Henry's wealth and his piety. The abbey church was enormous, the buildings were extensive, and Henry endowed the monastery with sufficient lands and revenues to support a large community of monks. The abbey would become one of the most important religious houses in the kingdom, a centre of learning and prayer. When King Henry died in 1135, he would be buried at Reading Abbey, his tomb a monument to his reign, and perhaps to his grief over the son he had lost. But grief and religious devotion could not solve the succession crisis that the White Ship disaster had created. King Henry had lost his only legitimate son. He still had one legitimate daughter, Matilda, who had been married to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V and was known as the Empress Matilda, even after her husband died in 1125. And Henry had numerous illegitimate children, including Robert of Gloucester, who was capable and respected, and would have made a plausible heir under different circumstances. But illegitimate children could not inherit the throne under the normal rules of succession, and while Henry might have tried to designate Robert as his heir, such a move would almost certainly have led to rebellion and civil war. In 1121, the year after the White Ship disaster, Henry remarried. His first wife, Matilda of Scotland, had died in 1118. Now, at approximately 53 years old, Henry took as his second wife Adeliza of Louvain, a young woman from a noble family in what is now Belgium. The marriage was clearly motivated by the succession crisis. Henry desperately needed another male heir, someone to replace William Adelin and secure the future of his dynasty. But the marriage, despite lasting until Henry's death 14 years later, produced no children, whether due to Henry's age, to some fertility issue affecting either spouse, or simply to bad luck. Adeliza never became pregnant. Year after year passed, and no child came. By the late 1120s, it had become clear that William Adelin would not be replaced, that Henry would have no new legitimate son to inherit his throne. This left the king with difficult choices, none of them entirely satisfactory. In the late 1120s, Henry made his decision. He would designate his daughter Matilda as his heir. On Christmas Day 1126, Henry summoned his barons to a great council and made them swear oaths to recognize Matilda as the legitimate heir to England and Normandy. This was an extraordinary step. England had never been ruled by a queen in her own right. The Norman tradition, like most medieval European traditions, was intensely patriarchal, with succession passing through the male line. Women could inherit and rule in some circumstances, but it was unusual and controversial. Many of the barons were deeply uncomfortable with the prospect of a female ruler. Moreover, in 1128, Henry arranged for Matilda to marry Geoffrey of Anjou, known as Geoffrey Plantagenet. This marriage, while politically useful because it allied the Norman dynasty with the powerful county of Anjou, was extremely unpopular with the Norman barons. Normandy and Anjou had a long history of conflict and rivalry. The idea of their duke's daughter marrying the Count of Anjou seemed like a betrayal to many Normans, and the prospect of Geoffrey or his descendants ruling Normandy was almost as unpalatable as the idea of a queen ruling in her own right. And Henry tried to address these concerns by making his barons repeatedly swear oaths to accept Matilda. On at least 3 separate occasions over the course of the late 1120s and early 1130s, he gathered his great men and made them swear to support Matilda's succession. These oaths were solemn, sacred things in medieval society. Swearing an oath bound you not just legally, but spiritually. To break an oath was a sin, a violation of your word before God and man. Henry hoped that by repeatedly extracting these oaths, by making the barons commit themselves over and over again, he could ensure that when he died, the succession would proceed smoothly. But oaths, however solemn, could be broken when it seemed advantageous to do so. And there were always people ready to provide theological or legal justifications for breaking oaths that had become inconvenient. Many of the barons who swore to support Matilda did so reluctantly, with mental reservations, already thinking about how they might avoid honouring their commitments when the time came. For the last years of Henry's reign, from the late 1120s until his death in 1135, the succession question hung over the kingdom like a dark cloud. Everyone knew that when Henry died, there would be a crisis. The question was not whether there would be conflict, but how severe it would be and who would emerge victorious. Matilda had supporters, certainly, including her capable and powerful illegitimate half-brother Robert of Gloucester. But she also had enemies and doubters, and people who would never accept a woman ruling over them. People who saw the succession as an opportunity to advance their own interests. The situation was made more volatile by the fact that Henry had male relatives with their own potential claims to the throne. Most notably, there was Stephen of Blois, the man who had left the White Ship before it sailed. Stephen was King Henry's nephew, the son of Henry's sister Adela and Count Stephen of Blois. He was a capable warrior, personable and generous, with his own power base in England and Normandy. Although he had sworn oaths to support Matilda, many people saw Stephen as a more acceptable alternative. A male ruler, someone who fit traditional expectations about kingship, someone who was not married to the Count of Anjou. Yet all of these tensions and rivalries remained mostly beneath the surface as long as King Henry lived. Henry, despite advancing age, remained a formidable figure, capable of enforcing his will and punishing those who opposed him. But everyone knew that when Henry died, all bets would be off. The carefully constructed facade of unity would collapse, and the kingdom would face the crisis that the White Ship disaster had made inevitable. On December 1st, 1135, King Henry I died at a hunting lodge called Lyon-la-Forêt in Normandy. According to tradition, he died from eating too many lamprey eels, a favourite delicacy that apparently disagreed with him fatally. Whether this story is literally true or merely a colourful legend, the fact is that Henry died suddenly, while still in Normandy, far from England. His death set off the succession crisis that everyone had been anticipating for 15 years. Matilda was in Anjou with her husband Geoffrey, pregnant with her third son, the future King Henry II. She could not travel immediately to claim her throne. Robert of Gloucester was in Normandy, but needed time to gather support and organise a response. Into this opening stepped Stephen of Blois. With remarkable speed and decisiveness, Stephen crossed to England, rode to London, and had himself crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey just 3 weeks after Henry's death, on December the 22nd, 1135. Stephen's seizure of the throne was a fait accompli that put Matilda and her supporters in a difficult position. Stephen was already crowned, already gathering support, already exercising royal authority. To oppose him now meant rebellion against an anointed king, a much more serious matter than simply supporting the rightful heir. Many of the barons, faced with the choice between supporting Matilda or accepting Stephen's rule, chose Stephen. Some did so because they preferred a male ruler. Some did so because Stephen was already on the throne, and opposing him seemed difficult and dangerous. Some did so because they had never truly intended to honour their oaths to Matilda anyway, and welcomed the excuse to break them. But Matilda did not accept Stephen's usurpation quietly. Neither did Robert of Gloucester and other loyal supporters. In 1138, Robert formally renounced his allegiance to Stephen and declared his support for Matilda, triggering a major regional rebellion. In 1139, Matilda herself invaded England with an army, landing at Arundel and establishing a base of operations in the west of England. The civil war that would become known as the Anarchy had begun. The period from 1135 to 1153, nearly 2 decades of civil war and disorder, became known to later historians as the Anarchy. The term comes from the Victorian historian William Stubbs, who used it to describe what he saw as a complete breakdown of law and order during Stephen's reign. Modern historians debate whether anarchy is too strong a term, whether the disorder was as complete and widespread as chroniclers suggested, but there is no doubt that this was a difficult and troubled time for England. The Anarchy was not one continuous war, but rather a series of campaigns, sieges, and occasional battles, interspersed with periods of relative peace when both sides were exhausted or regrouping. The country effectively split in two, with Stephen controlling the southeast, including London and much of eastern England, while Matilda and her supporters controlled the west and southwest, with Bristol serving as their main base of operations. In the middle were regions where control was contested, or where local barons took advantage of the chaos to act essentially independently, building unlicensed castles and ruling their territories as petty kingdoms. The warfare of the Anarchy was primarily about control of castles. Medieval castles were formidable defensive structures, and a determined garrison could hold out against besiegers for months or even years if they had sufficient supplies. Much of the military activity during the Anarchy consisted of sieges, one side surrounding a castle and trying to starve it into submission, while the defenders held out and hoped for relief. Occasionally, there would be raids into enemy territory to destroy crops and supplies, to intimidate the population, to demonstrate strength. Actual pitched battles were rare because they were too risky for both sides. The most significant battle of the Anarchy occurred at Lincoln on February 2nd, 1141. Stephen had been besieging a castle held by Matilda's supporters when Robert of Gloucester arrived with an army to relieve the siege. A battle ensued, and remarkably, Stephen was defeated and captured. The king himself became a prisoner, held by his enemies in Bristol Castle, where, ironically, Robert Curthose had been held by Henry I decades earlier. For several months in 1141, it looked as if Matilda had won. With Stephen captured and his supporters in disarray, she moved to consolidate her victory. She travelled to Winchester, the old capital, and then to London to be crowned queen. But Matilda's moment of triumph turned into disaster. In London, her high-handed behaviour and her demands for money alienated the city's inhabitants. Riots broke out, and Matilda was forced to flee London before she could be crowned. She had come within weeks of being crowned Queen of England, but her opportunity slipped away. The situation then reversed dramatically. Stephen's wife, also named Matilda, Matilda of Boulogne, rallied her husband's supporters and launched a counter-offensive. At the rout of Winchester in September 1141, Robert of Gloucester was captured. Suddenly, both sides held a valuable prisoner. Matilda held King Stephen. Stephen's supporters held Robert of Gloucester. A prisoner exchange was arranged. Stephen was released from captivity in November 1141 in exchange for Robert. The two sides were back to stalemate. The war dragged on year after year, with neither side able to deliver a knockout blow. Castles changed hands. Territories were won and lost. Individual nobles switched sides when it seemed advantageous, playing both kings against each other to maximize their own power and independence. The chroniclers of the time paint a grim picture of life during this period. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in its entry for 1137, it contains one of the most famous laments in medieval English literature. They filled the land with castles. They cruelly oppressed the wretched men of the land with castle works, and when the castles were made, They filled them with devils and evil men. Then they took those people whom they thought had any goods, both by night and by day, peasant men and women, and put them in prison and tortured them with unspeakable tortures for their gold and silver. They hung them by the feet and smoked them with foul smoke. They hung them by the thumbs or by the head and hung coats of mail on their feet. They put knotted strings around their heads and twisted them till they penetrated to the brains. Many thousands they killed with hunger. This passage, written in Old English by a chronicler who witnessed the horrors firsthand, and captures the suffering that the common people endured during the Anarchy. While the great nobles and their followers fought over castles and power, ordinary people paid the price. Farms were burned, crops destroyed, villages raided. Men were pressed into service in armies and often killed. Women were victims of violence. The normal systems of justice and protection that a strong king provided broke down, leaving people vulnerable to the predations of lawless barons and their soldiers. The Anarchy also saw a massive increase in castle building. Normally, castles could only be built with royal permission. The king controlled fortification rights because castles represented military power, and a king needed to ensure that his barons did not have the ability to rebel effectively. But during the Anarchy, with two rival claimants to the throne and no effective central authority, barons built castles without permission. These adulterine castles, as they were called, appeared throughout the country. By one estimate, perhaps 1,000 castles were built during Stephen's reign, though modern archaeology suggests the actual number was lower. Still, the proliferation of fortifications was a sign of how fractured and militarized England had become. The suffering of the common people during the Anarchy should not be understated, but historians also caution against seeing the entire period as one of universal chaos and misery. The worst of the disorder was concentrated in certain regions, particularly along the borders between territory controlled by Stephen and territory controlled by Matilda. In areas firmly controlled by one side or the other, life could proceed with reasonable normality. Markets functioned, crops were grown and harvested, trade continued. The Anarchy was terrible, but it was not the complete collapse of civilization that the most dramatic chroniclers' accounts might suggest. By the late 1140s, after more than a decade of inconclusive warfare, both sides were exhausted. Matilda, never able to secure sufficient support to win decisively, eventually gave up her personal ambitions for the throne. In 1148, she left England and returned to Normandy, never to return to the country she had fought so hard to rule. Her cause was taken up by her son Henry, who had been born in 1133 and was now approaching adulthood. Henry Fitz-Empress, or as he was known, Fitz-Empress meaning son of the Empress, was a very different figure than his mother. He was male, which immediately made him more acceptable to the traditional-minded barons. He was not married to a Count of Anjou. He was the Count of Anjou, having inherited the title from his father Geoffrey in 1151, and remarkably, in 1152, at just 19 years old, Henry married Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Europe. Eleanor was the Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, controlling vast territories in southern France. She had previously been married to King Louis VII of France, but that marriage was annulled. In 1152, within weeks of the annulment, Eleanor married Henry Fitz-Empress, bringing her enormous inheritance to the Angevin-Norman cause. This marriage transformed Henry's position. He was now not just Count of Anjou and claimant to Normandy and England, but also Duke of Aquitaine through his wife. If he could add England to his domains, he would be one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. In 1153, Henry crossed to England with an army, determined to press his claim to the throne. But by this point, both sides were tired of war, Stephen was aging, his health was failing, and many of his supporters were ready for peace. The death of Stephen's eldest son, Eustace, in August 1153, removed the possibility of Stephen founding his own dynasty and made a settlement more feasible. In November 1153, Stephen and Henry met at Wallingford and negotiated a treaty. Under its terms, Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but he would recognize Henry as his heir rather than his remaining son, William. When Stephen died, Henry would succeed him peacefully. The treaty ended the civil war, though Stephen would live for another year. When Stephen died in October 1154, 19 years almost to the day after he had seized the throne, Henry succeeded him as King Henry II of England, the first of the Plantagenet kings who would rule England for more than 3 centuries. Looking back from the vantage point of 1154, when Henry II finally brought the anarchy to an end, it is possible to trace a direct line of causation from the White Ship disaster to everything that followed. If the ship had not sunk, if William Adelin had lived to inherit his father's throne, the entire sequence of events would have been different, with William as king, and the succession would have proceeded smoothly. There would have been no succession crisis, no civil war, no anarchy. The Norman dynasty that William the Conqueror had established would have continued under his great-grandson. England would have been spared nearly 2 decades of warfare and disorder. Thousands of lives would not have been lost. Countless people would not have suffered the violence and disruption that the Civil War brought. And Richard of Normandy, if he had lived, would have served his half-brother King William as a loyal vassal and advisor. He would have married Amice de Gael and become a wealthy lord in Normandy and Brittany. He might have had children who would have founded a noble family, descendants who would have been prominent in the kingdom for generations. He might have played important roles in government and commanded armies, founded monasteries, lived to old age respected and honored. Instead, his life ended at 19 or 20 in the cold waters off Barfleur, one of 300 victims of a disaster that changed the course of a kingdom. The White Ship disaster has been remembered and commemorated in various ways over the centuries since it occurred. Medieval chroniclers recorded the event in detail, recognizing its importance. Later writers returned to it again and again, drawn by its dramatic and tragic nature. The Victorian poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti wrote a ballad called The White Ship in 1881, imagining the disaster in vivid detail and capturing the tragedy of all those young lives cut short. In more recent times, historians have continued to study the White Ship and its consequences. Charles Spencer, in the 9th Earl Spencer, published a book titled The White Ship Conquest, Anarchy, and the Wrecking of Henry I's Dream in 2022, providing a detailed account of the disaster and its aftermath. The book became a bestseller in the United Kingdom, demonstrating that 900 years later, people are still fascinated by this medieval catastrophe. In 2023, divers exploring the waters off Barfleur reported finding what may be significant sections of the White Ship's hull resting on the seabed. If confirmed, these remains would be a tangible connection to that fateful night, physical evidence of the disaster that has been preserved for 9 centuries in the cold waters of the English Channel. The discovery generated considerable media attention and renewed interest in the story. The White Ship disaster also appears in historical fiction. Ken Follett's novel The Pillars of the Earth, published in 1989, is set during the Anarchy and references the White Ship disaster as the event that triggered the Civil War. The novel was adapted into a television miniseries and a video game, introducing the story to new audiences. Ellis Peters's Brother Cadfael mystery series, set during the Anarchy, frequently references the Civil War and occasionally mentions the White Ship as its ultimate cause. For modern readers, the story of Richard of Normandy and the White Ship resonates in several ways. First, there is the universal human tragedy of young lives cut short, of potential unfulfilled. Richard was 19 or 20 years old, just beginning his adult life, with everything ahead of him. His death and the deaths of all those other young nobles aboard the White Ship represent a tragic waste, a loss of all they might have achieved and become if they had lived. Second, there is the historical fascination with how a single event can change the course of history. The White Ship disaster was not the result of some grand historical force or inevitable trend. It was the result of specific choices made by specific people on a specific night. If the crew had not been drinking, if Captain Thomas had refused the challenge to race the king's ship, if the ship had departed in daylight rather than darkness, if the course had been plotted more carefully, any of these things might have prevented the disaster. The contingent nature of history, the way that everything can turn on moments and decisions, it is nowhere more clearly illustrated than in the story of the White Ship. Third, there is the lesson about hubris and its consequences. The passengers and crew on the White Ship were confident, perhaps overconfident. They thought they could drink heavily and still sail safely. They thought they could navigate dangerous waters in darkness while intoxicated. They thought they could race the king's ship and win. Their confidence was misplaced, and the price of that misplaced confidence was 300 lives and a civil war. Fourth, there is the meditation on fate and fortune. The medieval people who witnessed the White Ship disaster interpreted it through the lens of their Christian faith. They saw it as divine punishment for sin, as God's judgment on the drunkenness and pride of those aboard. Modern and our more secular audiences might see it differently, as a tragic accident, as the inevitable result of human error and poor judgment. But whether we interpret it as divine will or as simple bad luck, the story reminds us that life is uncertain, that disaster can strike suddenly and without warning, that the future we expect is not always the future we get. What can we say finally about Richard of Normandy's place in history? On one level, his historical significance is limited. He was not a king or a great lord. He did not command armies or found dynasties. He lived only 19 or 20 years. If not for his death in the White Ship disaster, he would probably be barely remembered today. Perhaps a footnote in the histories of Henry I's reign, one among many royal bastards who received lands and titles and lived relatively prosperous but historically unremarkable lives. And yet, Richard's story matters. It matters because he was caught up in one of the pivotal events of English medieval history. His death, along with the deaths of William Adelin and all the others aboard the White Ship, set in motion the succession crisis and civil war that transformed England. In this sense, Richard and his fellow victims helped to create the conditions that led to the rise of the Plantagenet dynasty, one of the most important royal houses in English history. Richard's story also matters because it illustrates the experience of royal bastards in the medieval world. These individuals occupied a strange middle ground, acknowledged by their royal fathers, provided for generously, had given opportunities and advantages, but never fully legitimate, never able to inherit crowns or highest honours through the normal rules of succession. Richard's life, though brief, shows us how one such individual could prove his worth through military service, earn his father's favour, and secure a promising future through strategic marriage. His story humanizes what might otherwise be dry historical facts about succession laws and political arrangements. The story of Richard and the White Ship also reminds us that history is made up of individual human beings, each with their own hopes and dreams, fears and ambitions. Behind the dates and events, the battles and treaties that historians record, there were real people living real lives. Richard was one such person. We know relatively little about him compared to kings and queens, whose lives are documented in exhaustive detail, but we know enough to see him as a human being, a young man who fought bravely in his father's wars, who was loyal to his family, who had a promising future ahead of him, whose life was cut tragically short. In the centuries since the White Ship disaster, Richard of Normandy has been largely forgotten by popular memory, overshadowed by his legitimate half-brother William Adelin and by the famous figures of the Anarchy like Empress Matilda, King Stephen, and Henry II. But for historians studying this period, Richard serves as a reminder of all those who died that November night, all those whose stories are less well known, but who were equally victims of the disaster. The fact that Richard's body was recovered and identified, and that chroniclers noted his presence at the Battle of Brémule, that his betrothal to Amice de Gael was recorded. These details allow us to reconstruct at least the outline of his life. We can trace his education under Bishop Bloet, his military service with his father, his near capture at Les Andelys, and rescue by Ralph the Red, his promising betrothal, and finally his death in the disaster. It is more than we know about many medieval figures, enough to see Richard as a real person, rather than just a name in a list of the dead. As we near the end of our journey through Richard's life and the world he inhabited, as you drift towards sleep, dear listener, let us reflect on the themes that have emerged from this story. We have travelled through the Norman conquest of England, through the complicated politics of medieval kingship, how through military campaigns and succession crises. We have witnessed the optimism and confidence of a young man preparing for his wedding and his future as a Norman lord. And we have experienced the tragedy of the White Ship, the cold water and the darkness, the 300 souls lost in a single night. What lessons might we draw from this story as we prepare for sleep? Perhaps the most fundamental is the reminder of life's fragility and uncertainty. Richard seemed to have everything figured out. He had proven himself in battle. He had his father's favor. He had a wealthy bride waiting for him. The future appeared secure. And then, in the space of a few terrible hours, everything was gone. Life can change in an instant, for good or ill, and all our careful plans can be overturned by chance or fate or circumstance. This need not be a depressing thought. Yes, life is uncertain, but that uncertainty also means that possibilities remain open, that the future is not entirely predetermined, that our choices and actions matter. The passengers on the White Ship made choices: to drink heavily, to share wine with the crew, to attempt to race the king's ship, and those choices had consequences. But within the limits of circumstance and fortune, we all have agency, the ability to make decisions that shape our lives and the lives of those around us. Another theme that emerges from Richard's story is the importance of duty and loyalty. Richard served his father faithfully in war. Ralph the Red saved Richard from capture, demonstrating the bonds of loyalty that could develop between warriors. William Adelin turned back to try to save his half-sister, putting family obligation above his own safety. These medieval people took their obligations to each other seriously, understood that they were bound together by ties of blood and oath and mutual dependence. In our more individualistic modern world, there is perhaps something to be learned from this emphasis on duty and loyalty, even as we recognize that medieval society's hierarchies and inequalities are not models we should emulate uncritically. The story also illustrates how individual actions can have consequences far beyond what anyone intends or imagines. Captain Thomas Fitzstephen probably did not set out to destroy a dynasty or trigger a civil war. He was trying to serve the crown, to honor his family's tradition of service, perhaps to make a name for himself through his skill as a ship captain. But his decisions, to allow his crew to drink, to accept the challenge to race the king's ship, to navigate carelessly, had enormous consequences. The disaster he caused changed the course of English history. This is both sobering and instructive. Our actions matter, even when, especially when, we do not fully understand their potential impacts. There is also something to be said about grief and how people respond to loss. King Henry I's reaction to the news of his son's death, his collapse, and his screaming anguish reminds us that grief is a universal human experience that transcends time and culture. Whether in the 12th century or the 21st, the loss of a child is devastating. Henry's foundation of Reading Abbey in the wake of the disaster suggests one way that people have tried to find meaning in loss, to transform grief into something constructive, to create beauty and purpose out of sorrow. As you lie in your comfortable bed, in the safety and security of the modern world, it may be hard to fully imagine what life was like for Richard and his contemporaries. They lived without electricity or running water, without modern medicine or communications technology. They faced dangers we do not, disease, violence, accidents, as routine parts of life. The crossing of the English Channel, which we could make today in less than an hour on a ferry or in minutes on a train through the Channel Tunnel, was for them a dangerous and potentially deadly journey. And yet, for all the differences between their world and ours, the people of the 12th century were not so different from us. They loved and hated, hoped and feared, celebrated and mourned, just as we do. They formed friendships and rivalries, fell in love, worked to achieve their goals, tried to make sense of their place in the world. Richard's desires to prove himself in battle, to earn his father's respect, to marry well and establish himself as a lord, are understandable to us even across 9 centuries of change. The specifics of his world are foreign, but the underlying human experiences and emotions are familiar. The White Ship disaster stands as one of those moments in history when the veil between past and present seems thin. We can imagine, with no great difficulty, what that November night must have been like. The cold water, the darkness, the screaming, the desperate struggle for survival. These are visceral enough that we can almost feel them, even across the centuries. And in imagining Richard's final moments, we connect with him and with all those who died alongside him in a way that transcends the usual distance between present and past. It is also worth reflecting on the nature of historical memory and how we remember or forget the past. The White Ship disaster was famous in its own time and remained well known in England for centuries afterward. Medieval chroniclers recorded it carefully. Later historians studied it. Poets and novelists returned to it. And yet, ask most people today about the White Ship, and you will likely receive blank stares. This is one of the most significant events in English medieval history, but it has largely faded from popular consciousness, remembered by historians and history enthusiasts but unknown to most. This is the nature of historical memory. Some events remain famous across the centuries. The Battle of Hastings, the signing of Magna Carta, the execution of King Charles I, while others, equally important in their own time, fade into obscurity. The people of 1120 believed that the White Ship disaster would never be forgotten, that it was too momentous, too tragic, too important to ever fade from memory. And yet, here we are 900 years later, and most people have never heard of it. This too is instructive. It reminds us that even the most dramatic events, even the greatest tragedies, fade with time. The grief that seemed unbearable eventually becomes bearable. The disasters that shook the world eventually become history, studied by scholars but no longer immediate and present. Life continues. The world moves forward. Our new generations are born who do not remember what came before, who have their own concerns and their own tragedies to contend with. There is something both melancholy and comforting in this thought. Melancholy because it reminds us that we too will be forgotten, that the things that seem so important to us now will eventually fade into obscurity. But comforting too, because it suggests that even terrible events do not last forever, that time does heal, that humanity survives and continues despite whatever disasters befall it. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of Richard of Normandy's story, to the end of this long journey through the 11th and 12th centuries. We have travelled together through Norman England, through courts and castles, through battles and betrothals, through disaster and its aftermath. We have met kings and princes, warriors and bishops, survivors and victims. We have traced the consequences of one terrible night, watching as they rippled outward through time, touching hundreds of thousands of lives, shaping the course of a kingdom. Richard of Normandy himself lived only 19 or 20 years, but his story has lasted 9 centuries and counting. It persists because it touches on universal themes: the fragility of life, the unpredictability of fate, the way that individual actions and choices can have consequences far beyond what anyone imagines. It persists because it is dramatic and tragic, because it involves royalty and disaster, because it changed the course of history. And it persists because historians and storytellers have kept it alive, recording it, studying it, retelling it for each new generation. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, Richard's story becomes part of your own memory, one more strand in the great web of human history that connects us all to the past and to each other. You have walked for a few hours in Richard's world, imagined his experiences, thought about his life and death. In doing so, you have made a connection across the centuries, reaching back through time to touch, however briefly, the life of this medieval prince whose name is known to few, but whose story is worth remembering. Let your mind now release the details of Richard's story. Let the names and dates, the battles and treaties, the political complications and historical consequences all drift away like leaves on a stream. Keep only the essential emotional truth of the story, the tragedy, the loss, the reminder that life is precious and uncertain, and that we should value what we have while we have it, that our time here is limited and we should make the most of it. Think of Richard preparing to board the white ship that November evening, excited about the crossing, looking forward to his future with Amice, confident and happy and completely unaware of what was about to happen. Think of that moment of confidence before disaster strikes, that brief window when everything seems possible and the future stretches ahead full of promise. We all have such moments in our lives, times when we feel secure and optimistic, when the world seems aligned in our favor. Richard's story reminds us to cherish those moments while also recognizing their fragility. Think too of King Henry receiving the news of his son's death, collapsing in grief, crying out in anguish. Think of all the families who lost children and siblings and spouses in the white ship disaster, all the individual tragedies that made up the larger catastrophe. Their grief was real and raw and overwhelming, even though it happened 9 centuries ago. In remembering their pain, we honor their humanity and acknowledge the universal experience of loss that connects all human beings across time and culture. And finally, think of the white ship itself, resting on the seabed off Barfleur, slowly being covered by sediment and marine growth over the centuries, occasionally disturbed by curious divers who come to search for traces of the famous wreck. The ship that carried Richard and 300 others to their deaths has become part of the ocean floor, a part of the physical world that continues long after the human dramas played out in and around it have concluded. There is something fitting in this. The ship remains as a kind of monument, a marker of tragedy, even as the people aboard it have turned to dust and their stories have largely been forgotten. But tonight, just for these few hours, Richard's story has lived again. You have heard about his life, his education, his battles, his betrothal, his death. You have thought about what his life meant and what his death meant. You have connected with a young man who lived 900 years ago, whose world was so different from yours, but whose essential humanity was the same. In this act of remembering, of paying attention to a life that would otherwise be forgotten, there is a kind of redemption, or a way of saying that Richard's brief time on earth mattered, that he is not entirely lost to oblivion. Sleep now, dear listener, and let the story of Richard of Normandy fade into dreams. Let the Norman castles and medieval battles, the cold waters of the English Channel and the tragedy of the White Ship, all blend together with your own thoughts and experiences as you drift into unconsciousness. Tomorrow, you will wake to your own life, your own concerns, your own place in history. But tonight, you have spent time in another era, walked through another world, remembered lives long since ended. The past is a foreign country, as one author famously wrote, but it is also part of us. Everything that came before has shaped the world we inhabit now. The Plantagenet dynasty that emerged from the chaos of the Anarchy would rule England for 300 years. The legal and governmental systems that developed during the medieval period would evolve into the institutions we know today. The English language itself was shaped by the mingling of Norman French and Anglo-Saxon that began with William the Conqueror's conquest and continued through the medieval period. In a very real sense, we are all heirs to Richard's world, products of the history that he was briefly part of. Rest now in that knowledge. Rest in the understanding that you are part of a great continuum of human experience stretching back through Richard's time, through the medieval period, through the classical world, back to the earliest human societies. Countless people have lived and died, loved and suffered, and hoped and feared, each contributing their small part to the great story of humanity. Richard was one such person. You are another. The specifics differ, the times and places change, but the fundamental experiences remain surprisingly constant. Close your eyes and breathe slowly, deeply. Feel yourself relaxing, your body growing heavy and comfortable in your bed. Let your thoughts slow and drift. If you find yourself thinking about Richard or the White Ship or the Anarchy, let those thoughts pass without clinging to them. They have served their purpose, carrying you gently toward this moment of rest. Now you can release them, let them go. Allow sleep to take you wherever it will. The ship has sailed. The disaster has passed. The grief has faded into history. 900 years of time stand between us and that November night in 1120. The people involved are long dead. Their bodies return to earth. Their souls, if we believe in such things, gone to whatever afterlife awaits us all. The kingdom they fought over has transformed beyond recognition. The world they knew has vanished, but the story remains. Stories persist when everything else has crumbled into dust. They pass from generation to generation, changing in the telling but preserving something essential, some truth about human experience that transcends the specifics of any particular time or place. Tonight, you have heard Richard's story. Perhaps someday you will tell it to someone else, or perhaps you will simply carry it with you. One more piece of the great puzzle of history that helps you understand where we came from and how we got here. Sleep now. Dream of Norman England if you wish, of castles and knights, of sailing ships and cold northern seas, or dream of nothing at all. Simply rest and restore yourself, preparing for the challenges and opportunities that tomorrow will bring. The past is past. Richard and all those who died with him are beyond our help or our mourning, but we can remember them, honor their brief time on earth, learn from their experiences, and then move forward into our own lives. The White Ship has reached its final resting place, deep beneath the waters of the English Channel. The passengers aboard it have long since departed this world, but their story, preserved in chronicles and histories, retold by storytellers and historians, it has survived. And tonight, it has been told once more, softly and gently, designed not to agitate or disturb, but to soothe and comfort, to carry you peacefully into sleep. May your rest be deep and refreshing. May your dreams, if you remember them, be pleasant. May you wake in the morning renewed and ready, grateful for the gift of life and the opportunity to create your own story, to live your own days, to make your own mark on the world before you too pass into memory and history. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well. And remember, as you drift away, that you are connected to everything and everyone that came before, part of an unbroken chain of human experience that stretches back through Richard of Normandy, through all of history, to the very beginning of our species. In that continuity, there is comfort. In that connection, there is meaning. In that knowledge, there is peace. Sleep now. The story is told. The night is gentle. Tomorrow awaits. But for now, simply rest.